What matters is not good government, but good form of government. Immanuel Kant. In my previous lecture, I discussed how Kant was for the separation of powers into the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary branch that we also have today. In fact, if anything, he was for an even more strict separation of powers, especially between the legislative and the executive branch. But I also talked about how, to Kant, these three powers aren't equal, but rather the legislative power is in the hands of the sovereign or the overlord, of him who is the actual ruler of the state. Now, who that is, that's another question. In a monarchy, that would be the king. In an aristocracy, that would be the senate of aristocrats. In a democracy, that would be the people. But whoever holds the sovereignty is the overlord, is the supreme power. He, in Kant's system, has several tasks. He is tasked with defending the state, so organizing the military, leading the army. The sovereign is tasked with the institution as well as the inspection of the other two branches of government, so of the executive, of the ministers, as well as of the judiciary, of the judges. But the main task of the sovereign is the law giving. And he is supreme because at the end of the day, the executive has to follow the laws given by the legislative and has to execute those laws. And the judiciary has to judge, once again, according to the laws given by the legislative power. So the legislative is the supreme power. And of course, this leads to the issue what to do to prevent the legislative power from turning despotic. And this is exactly where the division of powers comes into play for Kant, because if they are strictly separated, then the legislative power can, of course, give laws, but they are executed by the executive power. And while the legislative power as such, the sovereign, cannot be sued, cannot be brought before court, because, once again, it is the sovereign power. It is the overlord. If someone could judge this power, then that judge would be the actual overlord. You cannot judge the monarch in an absolute monarchy, and you cannot judge the people as such in a democracy. But they may be the lawgiver, but as long as they don't execute the laws, as long as the executive executes the laws, then it is up to them how to interpret and how to deal with the laws. And they can be judged. Even the highest minister, even the governor, the regent of the state, can be brought before court in Kant's system and has to answer to the law. But this is something I discussed further in that previous lecture. Now, in the lecture before that, I discussed that to Kant there's a difference between ruling and governing. I explained how, to him, rulership is about the material about the content, about determining what is to happen. But government is about the form, about the how do we go about it. And I gave examples that Kant gives, like saying that in the individual, the senses rule, but reason should govern the senses. On the ship, the captain may rule, but the helmsman should govern the ship. And likewise, in the state, Kant would say, the sovereign, the lawgiver, the legislator, whoever he is, the king, the senate, the people, should have rulership, but he should not be in charge of the government. The government, once again, Kant is for separation of powers. The government should be its own thing and should, once again, determine the form, should interpret the material of the laws, of the orders given by the sovereign in a rational manner. Now, this leads Kant to say that there's a difference between the form of rulership and, on the other hand, the form of government in the state. The form of rulership, or also the form of the state, as Kant also calls it, that is about what the state's constitution says, how the state is made up, who is the sovereign. And here Kant goes with the three classical systems, the three classical options. He says there can either be one ruler in a monarchy, or there can be many rulers in an aristocracy, or everyone can be the ruler, the whole people can be the ruler in a democracy. And those are the forms of rulership or the forms of state. And they are, so to say, about the material of the state. How exactly is the state organized? But the thing is now that for Kant, this is in fact not so important. This is in fact secondary. What matters more to him is what he calls the form of government. And the form of government is about not the material, but the form of the state. So, how is the state governed? Not by whom is it ruled, but how is it governed? So, the form of the state is more about the executive branch. It's more about how exactly are the laws executed. And you could say, or Kant himself says, that it is this form of government that matters because the form of government is about the actual purpose of the state and its actions, while the form of rulership or the form of the state is more a means to an end. It is a means to achieve that purpose, but the actual purpose is realized by the government. And forms of government, Kant identifies two. A state is governed either in a despotic manner or in a republican manner. And we nowadays, in modern Western societies, are very much focused on democracy. We are used to putting democracy on a pedestal, saying basically all that matters in a state is that it is a democratic state. But as I already said previously, we tend to overblow the meaning of the word democracy. That is, we tend to put more into this word than what it actually means, because what it actually means is simply rule of the people. But nowadays you often hear things, and I even got taught in school, like, oh, if you have no rule of law, that's not democratic, or if you have no separation of powers, that's not democratic. You need to have checks and balances for democracy. But of course, these things have nothing to do with democracy as such. Ancient Athens was a democracy. It had rule of the people, at least of the free people. And yet still, there was no separation of powers in any modern sense. There was no rule of law in any modern sense. So we tend to identify the word democracy with basically everything that we think is good about a state, basically everything we think a state should be. But that is not what Kant does. For Kant, democracy is just one of the forms of rulership. It just means that the sovereign, the lawgiver, is the people. But it can still be despotic. Kant would say that each of the two forms of government can be combined with each of the three forms of rulership. So the rulership of one can be despotic, sure, in a tyranny, but it can also be republican in an aufklärt monarchy. The rulership of many can be despotic in an oligarchy, but it can also be republican in a proper aristocracy. And likewise, the rulership of the people, sure, in a proper democracy that can be republican, but in an autocracy, that is mob rule, it can also be despotic. Now, maybe one of the forms of rulership is more likely than another to turn despotic or to turn republican. But still, at the end of the day, as I already said, to Kant they are just means to an end. The end to Kant is not necessarily democracy, is not necessarily everyone sharing in the rule. Rather, the end is a republic, is a rational, a non-despotic state. So this leads me to the topic I want to discuss here, which is, of course, the difference of these two forms of government, of despotism and republicanism. And maybe the simplest way to put it is that to Kant, the state is despotic if the individual in the state, the subject of the state, the individual citizen, is helpless and at the mercy of the sovereign, and the sovereign can do whatever he wants, basically, arbitrarily. While, on the other hand, we live in a republic if we are safe from the sovereign. So, if we have rule of law. So, while today rule of law is often identified with democracy, that is, of course, not the case. In ancient Athens, it was democratic. You had rule of the people, but the people could band together against one. They could choose to banish one, or maybe in some instances also kill one. And there was not much to do about it. So that means that the single individual had no protection from the arbitrary choices of the sovereign. While when you have rule of law, then you have certain basic rights as an individual, and even a majority of 100% cannot simply vote to execute you for no reason. So here you have protection from the sovereign's arbitrary choices. That is maybe the most basic difference. Now, of course, the word republic is a word with a very unclear meaning nowadays. And not just nowadays. It has long been used in different senses. Maybe the most classical way to use the word is simply as meaning the opposite of a monarchy. So that's kind of how it was used in Kant's day in the 18th century. So it's not just that Kant distinguishes between despotism and republic, but rather most political thinkers of his day would say that the state is either a monarchy, which can be despotic when it's bad, or a republic. And here, republic simply meant a state without a monarch, without a prince. So, also states or entities that definitely weren't democratic and then maybe also were despotic, were called republics if they had no monarch, like many city-states in medieval times or the Renaissance or beyond that. Like the Republic of Venice was certainly more of an aristocracy, surely not a democracy, but it was called a republic because it had no monarch. Of course, this distinction between monarchy and republic goes back to ancient Rome, from where we get the word republic. And here we tend to distinguish the Republican period up until Caesar, and then the period of the empire, the period of the monarchy, starting with Augustus. But of course, that is actually not the distinction that the ancient Romans themselves made. Like, it's not that when Augustus rose to power, he officially abolished the republic and people immediately stopped calling their state republic. Now, in our days, we still somewhat keep this distinction. So we tend to not call a state a republic that has a monarch. And in such states, if you call yourself a republican, it means that you are against the monarchy, right? Like in the United Kingdom, that's not called a republic because it still has a king. But also, nowadays we often tend to more or less confuse the word republic with democracy. So we tend to think that it more or less means the same, or at least that in order to have a republic, you need to not just have no monarch, but you need to have democracy. And of course, many states, not only, but also the democratic states that have no monarchs, like to call themselves republics, like my state, the Federal Republic of Germany. Kant himself, he doesn't simply, at least for the most part, he definitely doesn't identify republic with monarchy, with democracy. And he also doesn't necessarily say that a state is a republic simply when it has no monarch. Rather, you could say, maybe in the most simple way, that to him the despotic state is a state where there's an opposition between the state and its people. So the state is like an usurper and oppressor above the people. And from that opposition, there also arises, at least potentially, an antagonism between the two. The state oppressing the people and the people being tempted to revolt against the state. While to him, a proper republic is a state where there is basically identity between state and people. And since they are one, since the state truly represents the people, there cannot be any antagonism between them. Maybe the word republic, as Kant understands it, is best defined by simply taking it literally, because it comes from the Latin res publica, the public thing or the public matter. So that which is not private, which does not concern individuals or families, but which concerns the public. And here I remind you of what I said in the lecture on what is justice to Kant, that we can judge justice, he says, according to the maxim of publicity. So just to him is that which can be public, while if something, some maxim destroys itself by becoming public, it is necessarily unjust, right? If you poison someone's food and make that public, tell that person, you will foil your own plan. Or if you try to grab someone's purse from his pocket and tell him, again, you will foil your own plan, which shows that that plan is unjust. Justice is that which can be public. And so therefore, you could say the republic, the res publica, is the public matter, is the matter of justice. So you have a republic if it is governed in such a manner, if it is governed in a public spirit, that all the principles, all the maxims of government could be publicized, so that the government does not have to hide anything, because publicizing it would probably harm its plans. While despotism has to hide. Despotism has to keep things secret from people. Now that is the maybe most simple possible distinction you can make. I want to go further into what Kant has to say about what is a republic, what makes a republic, what distinguishes it from the despotic state. But before I get into that, there is the question, how does Kant even arrive at specifically these three forms of rulership and these two forms of government? And here I have to remind you that Kant's scientific method is the architectonic. I discussed that in a previous lecture that you can check out if you haven't. Basically, what Kant is saying is that this method is what distinguishes scientific cognition from common cognition. If you just look around empirically, randomly looking, randomly searching, and taking up whatever you find, then this is rhapsodic and not systematic, and you never quite know for sure if you have found everything there is to find, Kant would say. So take the forms of rulership. Of course, it wasn't Kant who first said there's monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. Of course, we find these three described already amongst the ancient Greeks. But the issue is that the Greeks basically looked around empirically and they found, okay, there are some city-states here that are ruled democratically, others have a monarch, and so on. So they just described what they found. But if you work like that, you can of course not be sure that with these three forms of rulership, you have described all forms of rulership that exist or that could exist. I mean, how could an ancient Greek be certain that somewhere far away, let's say in China, there isn't a fourth type of rulership that he just hasn't seen yet? Or how can he be certain maybe there are only these three types right now, but how can he be certain that there isn't a fourth type that at least is possible? Maybe no one has tried it out and realized yet, but at least potentially it could be realized. This is why Kant insists on the architectonic method. He would say you need to first have a principle that you didn't find empirically, but rather that you arrived at a priori from reason, out of pure thinking. And that principle tells you basically how to divide the object you are dealing with, tells you the basic forms that whatever you are dealing with can take. And so you know what you have to look for, you know which forms and how many forms you have to fill out. And this rational principle that Kant uses for his architectonic method is usually his table of categories. This is also something I already gave a lecture on that you can check out. Basically, Kant says there are these 12 categories of our intellect, 12 basic concepts, 12 basic forms of thinking that simply by the nature of thinking, by the nature of our intellect, are the concepts we have to work with. And everything we think must be solved within these 12 concepts. We cannot possibly think of anything outside of these 12 basic concepts. And that is exactly why every thought that you can have, so in this case, the concept of a state, can be divided by and can be described by these categories. So, if we use the architectonic method and go by the table of categories, then I think it is clear that the three forms of rulership derive from the three categories of quantity. Kant doesn't outright say this, but I think it's quite clear. So the question here is, who is the ruler in the state? Or how many rulers should there be? And Kant says that there are only three ways in which we can think of quantity. These three ways being unity, plurality, or totality. So meaning every quantity we ever think must either be one or many or everything. And I think it's quite clear how this maps to the three forms of state. So we either have one ruler, one sovereign in monarchy, or we have many in aristocracy, or everyone is part of the sovereign in democracy. So here we arrive at the same forms of state that the ancient Greeks already described, but now we don't arrive at them empirically, we arrive at them from reason, and that way we now can be assured that there isn't a fourth one that we overlooked or that we just haven't thought of, but rather that it is not possible to think of a form of rulership, because in general it is not possible to think of any quantity except as one, as many, or as all. And so if you ask who is to be the ruler, the answer can also just be either one or many or all. But what about the forms of government? Republic and monarchy, republic and despotism. Here, it seems that Kant has forgotten his own architectonic method for a moment. He never quite explains why he believes that these two are the only two forms of government possible, and there couldn't be a third or fourth or fifth. And it seems to me that here he just took up what the political thinking of his time had already taught him. Because, as I already said, it was typical in the 18th century to say that a state is either a monarchy or a republic. And that a monarchy, if it goes bad, can be despotic. Now, Kant doesn't fully take up this distinction. Sometimes he does. You have to be careful when reading him. Sometimes the word despotism, when he uses it, seems to be about the bad, the unjust rulership of one person, so specifically the unjust monarchy. But then there are other instances where it is clear that he uses the term despotism in a broader sense, and that the unjust rulership of many, the oligarchy, or the unjust rulership of all, the autocracy, the mob rule, would also be despotic. So that basically despotism to him is more or less what we nowadays would call dictatorship. And certainly he fills this distinction with more content, with more depth than it usually had in the political thinking of his time. To him, it is about more than just, does the state have a monarch or not? As I already said, it's more about, is the state just? Does the state have rule of law? Am I protected from the sovereign and his arbitrariness, or am I not protected? But still, even though Kant fills this distinction with more depth, the basic distinction, at least it seems so to me, he just takes up from the thinkers that came before him without questioning it much. And so this is a bit of an inconsistency of Kant's, not applying his own scientific method here. So what if we try to help Kant and to improve Kant here and to be more Kantian than Kant was in this place? What if we try to deduce the possible forms of government from the table of categories? Well, in that case, I would say, while the forms of rulership must be deduced from the categories of quantity, the forms of government should be deduced from the categories of relation, because this is about the relation between the state or the government of the state and the people, the subjects of the state. And categories of relation, there are also three. There is the relation of subsistence and inherence. So basically the relation of a thing, a substance, with its own attributes, its accidents, like the relation between rose and red or between sugar and sweet. There is second the relation of causality or of dependence. So one cause causing an effect. And lastly, there is the relation of community or commerce or of the whole and the parts. Basically, several parts that together form a whole and that are codependent on one another, each determining the place the other has in the whole, while at the same time its own place being determined by that other. Well, I think if we go with these categories of relation, then it is quite clear that the Republic belongs in the last place. It belongs to the category of community, because here you have a state that is a true community, the citizens together forming the whole, and each determining the part of the other, so having his part determined by the whole representing the will of the people as such. But if we apply the architectonic method here, if we go with the three categories of relation, then it also becomes clear that there cannot be two, there must be three forms of government. So, what Kant simply calls despotism, I would say, needs to be divided into two different forms of government. Because I would say that despotic government can either simply be an autocratic government, where basically the ruler gives orders and others have to follow, and if they don't follow, they probably get punished. And this would fit with the category of causality, meaning that in such an autocratic state, you are not a citizen, you are just a subject. You are like the effect to a cause. You are dependent and you have to follow and obey. But then on the other hand, I would say a despotic state could also be a fascist state. And this I would identify with the first category of relation, with that of substance and accidents. Because I would say that fascism is not simply just another form of despotism, of dictatorship. It's not simply autocracy where you have a leader giving orders and people have to obey. Because in a regular autocracy, the people still have some sort of independence from the ruler, just like the effect has some sort of independence of the cause. Sure, your actions are determined by the ruler, by the ruler's orders. You have to obey, but you are still your own person. Just like when one billiard ball hits another and the second one rolls away, it's still its own independent ball, even though its rolling away is, of course, caused by the first ball hitting it. And in a regular autocracy, as long as you don't disobey, as long as you don't criticize, you can live a normal life, and within your private life, can have some small measure of freedom. But actual fascism does not want subjects. Fascism is about what the Nazis called Gleichschaltung, about coordination, you could say. So the Nazis like to talk about the Volkskörper, the body of the people. So to them, the whole state or the whole people was one giant organism. And you don't have independent subjects that simply follow the orders of the leader, but rather they are like cells in a body. They are not their own thing at all. And that's why I put this here with the category of substance and accidents. In fascism, the people just become accidents of the state, not even effects of a cause, not even subjects obeying an order, but rather they are supposed to all meld together with the state, to lose all individuality and all independence. And of course, this is also despotic. If once again, by despotism, we understand an arbitrary rule, not a rule of law. But in autocracy, you have the individual being at the mercy of the arbitrary rule of whoever is the autocrat, while in fascism, you are at the mercy of the arbitrary rule of the whole, which can even be more terrible. Woe unto him who dares to not be part of the Volkskörper, of the people's body, or who is deemed to be a parasite, who is deemed to be bad for the people's community. But there's clearly, to me, a difference between these forms of government. Now, of course, in Kant's day, there was not yet a fascist state. And so empirically, it was hardly possible to find this form of government or to come up with it. I mean, maybe Kant could have sort of something like that from literature, because I would say that certain political authors like Hobbes or like Plato already had envisioned something that came close to a form of fascism. But at the end of the day, empirically, you could only think of the the autocratic state, and then maybe you could also conceive of the rational republic. But that is precisely why Kant should have applied his own architectonic method here, because even if in his day no fascist state had ever existed, had he used that method, he could at least have envisioned the abstract possibility of such a state existing, of a state being governed in that manner. But be that as it may, while I say that according to the architectonic method, you would have to distinguish three forms of government: the fascist, the autocratic, and the republican government. Kant, going with what was typical for his time, only distinguishes despotism and republicanism. And now the question is, what distinguishes them more specifically? Or how does he define the republic? And here, most of the time, Kant describes three conditions that must be met for a state to be called a republic, or three characteristics of a republic. Now, the first of those three is freedom. I already mentioned in previous lectures, like the lecture on what is justice, that to Kant, the proper republic has freedom, law, and force. And the despotic state, on the other hand, has law and force, enforcing that law, but lacks freedom. So, in a way, it is precisely this first criteria which most distinguishes the republic from despotism. Is there freedom or isn't there? Are the people being oppressed or not? But of course, the question is, what is freedom to mean here? And freedom cannot mean total freedom from the state, freedom from any law, like the state not even forbidding me to murder or to steal. Because in that case, you would not have a republican state, you would have no state at all. You would live in the so-called state of nature. I talked in previous lectures, like my lecture on what is freedom, about how to Kant there are two types of freedom, which he likes to call, on the one hand, the wild or the savage freedom, and on the other hand, the civilized or the civil freedom or the freedom under the law. And basically, what this means is that the wild freedom's complete unrestricted freedom to do whatever you want, which ironically is not freedom at all to Kant, or at least doesn't remain freedom, because this unrestricted freedom destroys itself. If everyone is free to kill each other or to enslave each other, let's say, people will not stay free for long. So to Kant, the true freedom is the freedom restricted by law. But of course, the law should only restrict the wild freedom as much as is necessary to retain freedom. And that is precisely the point here where we are talking about the republic. So if, let's say, the state prohibits murdering each other, sure, in a way that takes freedom from us, but actually thereby it protects our freedom, because I would be a bit more unfree if I got murdered. So this would be republican. If, on the other hand, let's say the state forbids homosexual relations, that takes away freedom, but not in order to protect anyone's freedom, because it is not like if two men are allowed to be together or to have sex with each other, it's not like that has any effect on the freedom of others who don't want to join in. I mean, no one is forcing them to join in. So such a law would be despotic, because it restricts freedom more than necessary. So the criterion here for Kant is that he says, in a republic, I am subjected only to such laws as I could have possibly given to myself. I could have told myself, even if there was no such law, I won't murder anyone. And if there was no such law, I could have agreed to make it a law that murder should be forgiven. Maybe even if I would like to murder others, I could still have agreed to that law, because as much as I would like to murder others, what I would like even more is to not get murdered myself. So I might be willing to abstain from murdering others if it means being protected myself. But on the other hand, if I am gay, there's no way I would agree to a law that forbids homosexuality. Why would I? So I must only be subjected to laws that I could have given myself. That is republican. If I'm subjected to laws that I could not have given to myself, these must be arbitrary laws that are forced upon me, and that is despotic. Now, the important point is the wording. Laws that I could have given myself, not that I actually have given myself. So in the state, there might be laws that you don't like, that you would prefer not having to follow, but that alone is not enough to say that your state is despotic and is oppressing you. But rather the question is, could you, at least in theory, have agreed to those laws? So, I mean, maybe traffic laws, for example. Maybe the law says you have to drive on the right, but you personally would prefer driving on the left side of the street. Still, driving on the right is something you could have agreed to. While on the other hand, if the state, like the Nazi state, says, let's kill all the Jews, or if a state says that all the black people should be oppressed, should have less rights, should be enslaved, clearly that's something the Jews or the blacks could not have agreed to. Kant here distinguishes what he calls executive laws and legislative laws. And he would say that the executive laws, if you have like a parliament, it's enough for them to be passed with a simple majority. Again, like the traffic law, a simple majority is enough to say, let's all drive on the right. Even if you belong to the minority, sure, you could ask the question, why should I follow a law, even if the majority wants it, even if, let's say, the majority is 99%, as long as I don't belong to that majority, as long as I didn't want the law, why should I feel bound by it? But here Kant would say, while you maybe don't agree with that specific law, you can agree with the more general legislative law that laws should be decided by a majority, even if you, in a particular case, do not belong to the majority but to the minority. But what Kant calls legislative laws, so like basic constitutional laws, here he says a simple majority is not enough. They really should be agreed upon by everyone. And so it is proper that, for example, here where I live in Germany, we have certain basic laws like the right to live, the right to free speech, that according to the constitution cannot be changed, even if a majority was for changing them. That is not democratic, in fact. We like to say this is democracy, but if we take the word seriously, that is not democratic. That means that the people don't have the power to rule this over, but it is republican, meaning I am subjected to laws that I could have given myself, and the majority cannot subject me to other laws that I could not have given myself. The difference, therefore, is that in a republic, unlike a despotic state, no one has to submit to another's will, but rather you have to submit only to your own will. Kant would say that at least the good person doesn't even feel the existence of the state and of laws in daily life if the state is also good, that is, if it is republican, if it is rational. I mean, sure, technically the state restricts your freedom. It tells you you mustn't murder, you mustn't rape, you mustn't steal. But at least if you're a good person, you won't feel these restrictions, because the only freedom taken from you is the freedom to do things you didn't want to do anyways. I mean, I don't go through my daily life and think, oh, I would like to murder this person over there. Too bad. This is not allowed. This state is so oppressive, taking so much freedom from me. So basically, I don't even think of the fact that I'm not allowed to murder in my day-to-day life. Only an evil person actually feels the republican state. Only the evil person would feel restricted and oppressed here. On the other hand, in a despotic state, even a good person can feel restricted and oppressed. Like if the state, once again, prohibits homosexual acts, a good person who happens to be gay will feel that his freedom is restricted. Or if the state doesn't allow the freedom of speech, than a good person who has to say something which is perfectly fine and rational and good, but which happens to be forbidden by the state, will feel restricted. So that is basically the difference. You have despotism, you have lack of freedom if you are subjected to somehow arbitrary laws, to laws that you have to follow despite not wanting to follow them, simply because the state is stronger than you and forces you to follow them, threatens you if you don't follow them. And what's important here is that Kant says this is true even if it is benevolent, a well meaning despotism. That is, even if those restrictive laws that take your freedom away do so in order to make you happy. To Kant, despotism is not the same necessarily as tyranny. Tyranny is a form of despotism where the people get basically mistreated and tortured by their despot. But even if that is not happening, even if the despotic government is well-meaning and tries to care for the common welfare of the people, it is still despotic if it forces people to become happy according to its own, that is the government's, concept of happiness. That is, for example, let's say if the government forces people to live what the government thinks is a healthy life, forces them to work out, forces them to eat certain foods, or a thing that actually is happening in many states, right? If certain drugs are forbidden on the grounds simply that they are bad for the people. This is despotic because it forces people to be happy. And here Kant says actual freedom is precisely not about being made happy, like a little child where the parent decides what's good for the child, but rather true freedom means that I have the freedom to make myself happy, to, as the American Declaration of Independence says it, to pursue my own happiness, however I see fit, not however the government sees fit, or rather however I see fit, except in ways that would impede on others' freedom and happiness. Of course, I cannot say it makes me happy to rape someone or to steal from someone, so I'm free to do it. But within the bounds of me not threatening others' freedom, I should have the freedom to make myself happy. And Kant says you can, as a human being, maybe for animals that's different, but as a human being, you cannot truly be happy if you are forced to be happy according to someone else's concepts of happiness. Because we are rational, we are autonomous beings. But if our freedom is taken away from us, then that means that our own judgment becomes meaningless. I can judge something to be good or bad, but whether I judge it to be so does not matter. Only the judgment of the government that forces me to do something or to not do something matters. So my judgment becomes meaningless. My free choice based on my own judgment is taken away from me. And that means that my dignity as a rational being is taken away. That means that I'm being treated like cattle or like a pet, like a child. And that way I cannot, without my dignity, I cannot be happy. Kant does allow that a very rough, very uncivilized people, as he would say, maybe does need a despotic government at first, that maybe this is a necessary evil to first discipline these people so that they can be subjected to laws at all. Um, but in general, he would say um, the government should not take people's freedom, not even in a well meaning manner, not even to force them to be happy. To him, the state does not have a positive task, that is, to do something for the people, but rather its task is a negative one. The state should just restrict freedom as much as is necessary to protect freedom. So everyone should be allowed to work on his own purposes, on his own goals, whatever they may be, and they can even be non-moral, they can even be egoistic ones, just as long as this does not involve harming other people or preventing other people from reaching their purposes, their goals. However, I do want to stress that this does not mean that Kant is simply a liberal who simply says that the state should ensure the empty, merely formal freedom of the people and not do anything for the people, so that anyone in theory has the freedom to become a billionaire, but everyone also has the freedom to become homeless. No, in Kant's mind, the state does have some social tasks also. For example, Kant does say that the state needs to ensure that the basic necessities of life um, can be bought with cheap, with affordable prices, because if even the cost of living, of rent, or even the cost of basic food or basic education are not affordable for normal people, then indeed their freedom, this negative freedom to be protected from others, um, is empty. It's a merely formal freedom. Again, in theory, sure, they could become billionaires. It's not forbidden for them. Um, but it is not a true material freedom. They wouldn't truly be free to pursue their own happiness. So the state does have to ensure that people actually do have a chance to pursue their happiness. But what the state mustn't do is force certain concepts of happiness upon them. Rather, it just negatively needs to protect their freedom. In relation with this first criterion, the criterion of freedom, Kant characterizes the form of government as either paternalistic or patriotic. Because Kant says, in the first case, the sovereign sees himself as sort of the father of the country, and he treats the people of his country like children. That is, he doesn't treat them as independent, autonomous human beings, but as needing guidance and not being able to take care of themselves. And this may be well meaning. The sovereign may truly try to do what he thinks is best for the people. And maybe he may even succeed to a degree. So, once again, despotism is not necessarily tyranny. So, many people might enjoy living under such a despotism. Many people might see this benevolent, fatherly despot as truly a good ruler. But still, Kant would say such a government is oppressive. What he's saying is that the job of the state is not to make us happy. That is our own job. Everyone can pursue his own happiness, but rather simply to secure our freedom and our security. And here I point you back to my lecture on why there needs to be a state, because you have to remember what is the alternative to having a state. The alternative is living in the so-called state of nature, where there is no state, no institutions, no laws. And what is that state like? Well, it is not a state of necessary unhappiness, Kant would say. So, in the state of nature, it is theoretically possible that someone attains happiness for himself. And since it is possible here without the state, happiness cannot be the reason to create and to enter a state. The state is not necessarily needed for happiness. But what the state of nature is definitely lacking, it's not happiness, but it is justice. Kant characterizes it as a state of at least potential war of all against all, of insecurity, permanent insecurity, and permanently being threatened, having no guarantee that my property will be respected by others, will remain mine. So it is this justice, it is peace, which is lacking in the state of nature. And therefore, the state is created not for happiness, which I could have without it, but for peace, which I could not have without it. And Kant says that if the sovereign, whoever he is, the monarch, the senate of aristocrats, the people, this is not about a form of rulership, once again, but if the sovereign tries to force people to be happy according to his own concepts of happiness, this is always patronizing. This is always treating the people as children. And this is gonna turn despotic. So this is something you will find wherever there is no separation between church and state, right? No matter which faith, no matter which church is in charge, it will try to force people to follow the commandments of its faith. It will, for example, forbid homosexuality, or prohibit people from working on the Sabbath, or it will force women to veil themselves. And this may be well-meaning. The people enforcing such laws may really think that they are saving people from hell, that if people don't follow these commandments, they don't go to heaven. But even if someone believes that, you could tell him, well, that's the other people's problem, right? And if you want to save them, you can be a missionary. You can try to talk to people. You can try to convince people of your faith and of following your commandments. But you mustn't force them through the state. It is not the state's job to save people from hell or to get people into heaven, as it is not the state's job at all to make them happy. It is just the state's job to secure peace between people, to make sure there is no war of all against all, so that everyone has the option of pursuing his own happiness. So sure, the state should ensure there is freedom of belief, so that everyone could join your church and follow your commandments. but they should also have the option to not do so, even if maybe you are white and that will make them unhappy in the end. But this, of course, is also a problem that can arise in secular governments. I mean, think of communism. To this day, there are proponents of communism that will excuse all the crimes that were committed in the name of communism in the Soviet Union, in China, in North Korea, in Cambodia, in Vietnam, in Cuba, whatever. And they may say, oh, this always wasn't real communism. Communism just got abused and misused here. I'm not doubting that many of them are well-meaning and that many of them indeed do not want these crimes, do not want these mass murders. But if something keeps again and again being allegedly abused and allegedly misapplied, at some point you should ask, especially since Aufklärung is about self-criticism, if maybe the issue is within that thing itself, if maybe within that thing itself there is something that always leads to these results. And I would say with Kant, the problem is that if you have an ideology that sets out not just to free people, not just to create justice, but rather to make people happy even, to create common welfare, then whenever that ideology rises to power, it necessarily must turn despotic. Whether some of its supporters or whether the people who originally soaked it up and theorized it planned for this or not. And of course, this is also something that Kant could see in his own day, in the French Revolution. In the French Revolution, what rose to power was the Committee of Public Safety, or maybe it would be better translated as the Committee of Public Welfare. And that very name, you could say, coming from Kant, already told us that things would go bad, that this would lead to the reign of terror. Because if it is not about public justice, if it is not about public peace, but rather about the welfare of the public, then this must turn despotic. Then this must turn into trying to force the people to be happy and possibly removing anyone who you think stands in the way of that. The sovereign or overlord in the state, Kant says, should not act like a father towards immature, dependent children, but rather, if anything, he should only be like an elder, like a first amongst equals. And so the government should not be paternalistic, it should be patriotic. Now, the second criterion of a republic is that everyone be equally much a subject of the state as everyone else. Now, we may not be used to using the word subject much nowadays. We associate the word subject mostly with monarchies, being the subject of a monarch, and therefore it seems to us to kind of run counter to what a republic is. How can you be a subject in a republic? On top of that, we also tend to maybe consider the word subject to be a bit humiliating, right? I don't want to be a subject. I want to be a citizen, a free citizen, because a subject is someone who is subjected to someone else's rule, right? But to that, Kant would say that indeed people should be subjected to the state's rule. Otherwise, you don't really have a state. Otherwise, you have anarchy. So, in a sense, there should not be freedom. That is, there should be no freedom from the law. No one should be exempt from the law. You should be subjected to the law, and therefore you should be subjected to the sovereign, who, as the overlord, is the lawgiver, be it the king, the senate, or the people. Of course, the laws as such should be laws that don't oppress your freedom, but rather secure your freedom. There should be laws that you could have given and agreed with yourself. That was the first criterion. But the laws that there are, from them you should not be free. To them, you should be subjected. Everyone in the state should equally be subjected to them. Kant exempts from this only the sovereign. The sovereign is above the law because he is the one who gives the law, and it would be absurd to say that he should be subjected to his own law, that he should depend on himself. Which, once again, is why in an absolute monarchy it is the monarch, but in a democracy, for example, it is the people who cannot be held accountable according to the law. But everyone who is not the sovereign must be equally dependent on the state and must equally be a subject to the state's laws. That is very important for Kant. And from this second criterion follows necessarily the equality of everyone before the law. Kant says there must be no lord in the state except the overlord. And by that he means everyone in the state should be subjected to the same law, that is, to the state in total, to the lawgiver, but no one should be, on top of being subjected to the state and its laws as such, also be subjected to someone who is a lord to him, but who, despite being his lord towards the state, is still a subject. So, for that reason, there cannot be any system of caste like in India. For that reason, there cannot be any kind of nobility that people are born into. And likewise, there can be no slavery, and there can be no serfdom, which was something that during Kant's lifetime still existed, and that Kant criticized very much. Kant would say that it must be possible, at least hypothetically, for any person in the state to rise to the highest position and highest honor there is beneath the sovereign. So if the sovereign is an absolute monarch, then okay, it must not be possible for everyone to become king. Only the prince can become king. But it must be possible for everyone to become prime minister or chancellor or grand vizier or whatever you want to call the guy beneath the king that leads the government. And likewise, also, Kant would say it must be possible for everyone in the state to fall to the lowest position or to get the highest punishment there is. Whatever the highest punishment may be, whether you have the death penalty or whether you have lifelong imprisonment, whatever. But anyone must be able to earn that punishment for himself. It cannot be that some people are punished harsher while others who commit the same crime, because maybe they are nobles, get punished less harshly, right? Like that's how it was in the past. Even when it came to the death penalty, even if a noble was put to death, it was done in a more simple, more painless, more dignified manner, like cutting off his head, while a peasant probably wasn't beheaded, but was maybe hanged or put on the wheel or quartered or whatever. And this cannot be, Kant says. Because the main principle here for him is everything that you can deserve, any position, any honor, but also any punishment, everyone in the state must be able to deserve for himself. And whatever you get, good or bad, must depend on your deeds, on your actions. But birth, Kant says, is not a deed. You didn't choose to be born. So it cannot be that simply by birth you become a nobleman or you become a serf or a slave because you did not choose to be born into this family, into this position. And that's why there must be equality. Now, Kant is clear that by equality, he does not mean physical equality. When he says everyone should be equal in the state, he does not mean everyone needs to have the same abilities or anyone must have the same wealth. No, he's quite clear that he means specifically equality before the law. And here too, Kant does not mean that the same laws must apply to everyone in the same way. He's not saying that there cannot be people that have more rights than others, that there cannot be people that are privileged. There absolutely can. Kant says there can be something like a nobility, that is people that hold a certain position that comes with certain rights, just it mustn't be a nobility by birth, right? That's what we have now. There is immunity for certain political offices, for like MPs, that have immunity before the law. So in a way, they have more rights than you and me. But this does not come with birth, but rather anyone can get to that office and get that immunity. And once they leave that office, they also lose these specific rights. Likewise, when it comes to taxes, Kant is not saying that everyone must be taxed the same. He would say there can be special taxes for special people, or there can be tax exemptions, maybe, for someone because he's poor. But what cannot be, again, is that this is determined by birth. That, for example, nobles are exempted from taxes simply because they were born as nobles. No, if there are exemptions, for example, for poor people, well, that depends on your actions. Anyone could hypothetically become poor and then anyone would be exempted. But anyone could also hypothetically become wealthy and would then have to pay more taxes. This is, for example, why Kant is against what back then was called Kopfsteuer, the head tax. So back then you had people being taxed per head, meaning every person, everyone who has a head, simply for existing, has to pay a specific tax, which of course meant that poor families with many children were taxed more, because here the father would have to pay for each child. Here Kant once again says being born, existing, having a head, that is not a deed, so that should not be taxed. Working and earning money, that is a deed, so an income tax is okay. But a head tax, a tax simply on being alive, that is not okay. In passing, I will also say that Kant himself does not yet think about the emancipation of women. But I would say that your sex, of course, is also something that you didn't choose. It also does not depend on a deed. It's just like being a noble or being a slave or whatever, something you were simply born with. So if Kant does not want legal equality for women, this is not a fault of his philosophy, that is, of his principle. This is just an inconsistency. This is a fault of him as a person not fully applying his principle here. But I would say that it follows necessarily from that principle that there also needs to be equality between the sexes, because once again, the sex is also something that does not depend on your deed. Now, this equality before the law, or this equality of dependence on the state, being equally much subjects of the state, is an equality of force, Kant says. All of right is about force in the end. Here you can go back to my lecture on the difference between ethics and right. Both Kant subsumes under morality, under the doctrine of duty, so both are about what we should do. But the difference is that ethical duties are about what we should make ourselves do, what we will do if we have a good will. While the duties of right are duties that, sure, I should also make myself do, but even if I don't, they come with a right for other people to force me to do this duty, right? I have a duty to not kill others, to not rape, to not steal from others. But if I try to do it, they have the right to force me to not do it. They have a right to self-defense. They have a right to fight me off. And this is true in the state of nature already. In the state of nature, I can force others to accept my rights, to accept my freedom, to accept my property. I can defend what is mine. But when we leave the state of nature, when we enter the civil state, when we create an actual state with actual laws, then Kant says this right to force others, we as individuals lose this right to immediately force others, and rather we give it to the state. And so equality before the law to Kant means no one in the state can be forced to anything except through the state. Right? So someone can still force me to do my duties, to do my obligations, but not directly, not through his own force, but through the state's force. So if I have a contract with someone to work for him, and then I don't fulfill my part of the contract, then he can not just come and beat me over the head and enslave me and force me to work for him, but he can go to court, he can sue me, and the state can force me to do my obligation. And likewise, if let's say someone steals my bike and then keeps it in his garage, and I know that it is there, then I can notify the police. And the police will search his house, and if they find my bike, they will give me my bike back. So through the state, I force the thief to give me back my bike. But I'm not allowed to force him myself, right? I'm not allowed to break into his house or to threaten him with a gun to get my bike back. So that's the point to Kant. It is despotic if people are still allowed to force other people directly. That would be like it is in the state of nature. That is precisely why we leave the state of nature, because we don't want that. Of course, there might be a specific situation where that is necessary. Like if someone directly attacks me, of course, I have a right to self-defense. I don't have to just take it till the police arrives and saves me. But in that situation, we basically, for a moment, re-enter the state of nature, right? Because the state is not there, because the police is not present to save me directly, I and the other guy who attacks me are back in the state of nature where everyone has to defend his own rights, and where not the one in the right wins, but the one who is stronger wins. But of course, this is a situation that ideally in a perfect state would be prevented. And normally, in a non-despotic state, you cannot force others except through the state. On the other hand, a state where there is lords, masters, beneath the overlord, beneath the sovereign who is master over all, so a state where some people are allowed to force others without having to go through the state, that is a despotic state, right? If the nobility can force the serfs or the master can force the slave directly, that is despotic. And also this equality before the law, that also means that it always runs both ways, right? I can force others through the law, but they can also force me. Even the thief who has stolen my bike and whom I can force through the law to give it back to me, if I now stole his bike, despite him being a thief, he still can sue me also and force me to give back his bike. So that is what the republic is, according to the second criterion. It is a state where even the lowest beggar can sue and force the highest minister through the state, through the monopoly on power that the state has. And where the state does have the monopoly, so no one else has power to force others. And again, the laws don't need to apply equally to everyone. Not everyone needs to be under the same laws. Some people through the law can have more rights than others. Like, for example, people that are of age, that are over 18, have certain rights that younger people don't have. That's not the point. That's not what makes the state despotic. But the point is that everyone, no matter how low on the social or legal ladder he is, still can force others through the law. Even the child, maybe the child will not do it himself, but will be in court through a representative. But even the child, when it is harmed, when it is stolen from, when it is beaten, or when someone tries to murder it, has rights and can force others through court. And that is what Kant means by equality before the law, or by everyone being equally dependent on the state, equally a subject of the state. And I will point out that here the philosophy of right has a clear parallel with ethics. Because Kant says that in the kingdom of purposes, that is like in the invisible but intelligible, so thinkable realm that we share with all rational beings. I discussed that further in its own lecture on the kingdom of purposes. In the kingdom of purposes, it also is the case that all who are citizens in it, that is, all rational, all free, all autonomous beings, are equal before the law, that is, in this case, the moral law, that is the categorical imperative. So it may be that some rational beings are in many ways superior to others. I mean, the only rational being we know is the human being, but there might be others. There might be aliens on other planets, and who knows, maybe there are also spiritual beings like jinn or like angels or whatever. Maybe there are beings like the gods of polytheism. So maybe there are rational beings that are immensely more powerful or immensely more knowledgeable and insightful than we are. But Kant would say that these are just as much subjected to the moral law as we are. So not only do we have duties towards them, they also have duties towards us. Like if there were gods, like the Greek gods, like Zeus or Poseidon or whatever, and they were like to kill a human being, for example, that would equally be a crime than a human being killing another human being. You cannot simply say, "Oh, they are gods; they are so much above us. To them we are just ants." The point is, we are not just ants. We are rational beings. We have autonomy, and therefore we have dignity. Doesn't matter if we know less or if we are less powerful, we have the same amount of dignity, and the moral law applies equally to us. And indeed, that is, for example, why we can judge a being like the devil to be evil, right? Otherwise, the devil could say, I'm the highest seraph, I was the highest of angels, I'm much better than humans, so if I'm cruel to them, if I'm harming them, I'm above their morality. Their morality does not apply to me. And then we could not say that he is evil for what he does. But we can say that. And I mean, there is this story, right? There's this exact story in the Quran that Iblis, so the Satan, does say he is better than Adam, than the human being, because Adam is made from earth, from dirt, from clay, and he, Iblis, being a jinn, he is made from fire. But clearly, God does not accept this argument. So doesn't matter if you come from dirt or if you come from fire. As rational beings, we are all equally under the moral law, so we equally have duties towards one another. And just like within the state, only the sovereign, who himself is the lawgiver, is above the law, cannot be forced through the law by the subjects, but rather the subjects can force other subjects through him, through the power of the sovereign. Just like that, in the kingdom of purposes, God is the sovereign to Kant, who is above the moral law, which here does not mean that he can do whatever he wants. And when God does something evil, like randomly kill a person, it's not evil, he cannot be judged, but rather it means God simply will not do something evil. Kant says God is a being which has only rights but no duties. But that doesn't mean he does arbitrarily whatever he wants to us. It simply means he would never even want to not follow the moral law. But you cannot say that he follows it in the sense that he is subject to it, but rather what for all other rational beings is a duty, for him is something he actually wants to do. Because God, well, it's not even right to say he is above the law, rather to Kant, he is the personified moral law. So we here have a sovereign who cannot do wrong, who cannot do evil, because he cannot want to ever do evil. And this is exactly how the earthly, how the legal sovereign in the state ideally should also be. I discussed this in my lecture on the separation of powers and on sovereignty. Ideally, the state should be organized in such a manner that the sovereign cannot turn despotic, cannot want something unjust, and that it is truly impossible for him to even want something that would be a bad law, that would not be just. But this is the second criterion of the Republic. As human beings, we must be free, we must be subjected only to laws that we could agree to. But as subjects, as people who are subjected to the state, to the monopoly on power that the state has, to the laws that the sovereign gives, we must all equally be dependent on the state. That is, there must be no one that has any power to force us except the state itself, and we must be able to force others through the state, right? This is precisely why there can also not be any slavery, because if you have a slave, the slave can be forced, but he cannot force, right? A runaway slave, the owner can notify the state that his slave ran away, and then the state's authorities, the police, may help the owner catch him. That is, they may force the slave to come back, but the slave, on the other hand, cannot force his owner. The slave cannot sue the owner for mistreating. So, in that sense, the second criterion demands equality before the law. Now, the demand that the sovereign should not be able to even want to give unjust laws leads me to the third and final criterion of the Republic. And that is that Kant says, sure, insofar as people are subjected to the state and dependent on the state, insofar as they are, you could say, passive members of the state, they should indeed all be subjected, and they should equally be subjected. But that alone is not enough in order for the state to not be despotic. A state could still be despotic even if there's no nobility, no privileged caste, as long as all are equally subjected to the one despot. As long as they are only subjected, as long as they are only passive members of the state, that is still despotic. They need to also be active members, not of the state as such, but rather of the sovereign, that is, of the lawgiver. And that is what makes you a citizen. So to Kant, we are subjects of the state, even in a non-monarchy, insofar as we are subjected to the state's power, to the state's laws. But at the same time, we are citizens of the state, insofar as we play an active role in the law giving. Now, the point for Kant is that to him it is very important, I already addressed this in the lecture on the separation of powers and on sovereignty, that the sovereign, the law-giving power, be irreprehensible, holy even, that he only give truly just laws, that he cannot do anyone an injustice. Because Kant says, if the other powers, the executive or the judiciary power, if they do wrong sometimes, if they do an injustice, of course, ideally it shouldn't happen, of course. But it's not the end of the world, and it's not what turns the state from a republic into a despotic state, because these are still judged according to the law. So I can force these powers by the law, right? So let's say the executive branch does an injustice. Let's say there's police brutality. Ideally there wouldn't be police brutality, but let's say there is. Ideally, I can now sue the responsible policeman and get justice. So it is not such a fundamental problem if the policemen are not fully just and perfect. Of course, it is necessary that the other branches, that the other powers be subjected to the law so that I can force them. Kant says a law cannot protect me if I cannot hold those who are supposed to execute that law, who are supposed to govern me by that law, accountable, and if I cannot force them according to that law, right? So, for example, it would be useless to have a law that says you have the freedom to demonstrate if still the executive, the police, can just keep people from demonstrating, can just imprison and jail demonstrators, and cannot be sued for that. Then the law would not be worth the paper it is printed on. No, if there is such a law, it must also be possible to hold those who execute the law accountable. But even if that is the case, there still remains the problem. Okay, I may be protected from those who apply and execute the law, but who protects me from the law as such? Maybe I can sue the policeman for police brutality or for unjustly ending a demonstration. But what if the sovereign lawgiver himself takes away the right to demonstrate? I cannot sue him. This is exactly where Fichte would differentiate between merely formal and material rule of law. So the material rule of law would mean that you actually have just laws, while the formal rule of law would mean that it's not arbitrary, you are ruled by the laws, no matter whether they are just or not. So imagine you're living in the Nazi times and someone denounces you as secretly being a Jew. Now, if you would just merely on basis of an unproven accusation would just be sent away and killed, then there would not even be the formal rule of law. If, however, a court would really get into this, would really ask, is there evidence for you being a Jew? And would only convict you on evidence, and would follow the principle that in dubio pro reo. So if there's no evidence of you being a Jew, even if there's no evidence of you being an Aryan, you would be set free. Then this would be a formal rule of law. That is, the law would be correctly applied. But of course, there would still be no material rule of law, because the law that Jews have no right to live is, of course, an unjust law. So the question is, how would we achieve this material rule of law? How would we make sure that the sovereign himself cannot give unjust laws, because he cannot be judged by the laws? He is above the law, because, well, that is what sovereign means. Superanus, above everything. Kant says, if there was a power in the state strong enough to not force individual subjects of the state, but rather to force the sovereign, the overlord of the state, then that power would be the true sovereign. That could not be forced by anyone, and that would be in danger of turning despotic. So the problem would not be solved. So how do we solve that problem? Well, Kant says, if you are subjected to someone else's will, even if that other person may be well-meaning, that other person can always do injustice to you, even if just by accident. The only person who can never do an injustice to you is you yourself. If you are subjected to your own will, you cannot be subjected to an injustice. So if we don't want the people to be ruled despotically by arbitrary, unjust laws, then the solution to Kant is that the people must rule themselves. The people must give themselves the law, because you cannot be unjust towards yourself. And this does not simply mean, as we would now understand it according to our concepts of democracy, that there needs to be a vote and a majority, but rather you can think of Rousseau. Kant is thinking of a general will. Not many particular wills agreeing on the same thing, not a majority of particular wills, but a general will. Because he says the general will, so the will not of individuals but of the whole, must always be good. And that is true even if all the particular wills are evil. I said it before in a previous lecture that to Kant, a good state with good laws, with a good constitution, is a state that would work even if it was a state of devils, that does not require everyone to be an angel. Because Kant says the peculiar thing about evil is that evil contradicts other evil. Evil opposes other evil because evil is selfish. And so the compromise between different selfish evil wills would still be good. So let's say in the state of nature, you and your neighbor would both like to steal from the other. You have taken some things as your property, he has taken some as his, you want to take his things. So you both have an evil will. But the thing is, at the same time, out of the same selfishness that makes you want to steal from him, you of course don't want your own stuff stolen. So you might go to him and say, hey, let's make a contract. I want you to promise me to not steal my things. Now, of course, he will answer, why would I promise to not steal your things while you still try to steal my things? What's in it for me? That would just be stupid. So I will give you that promise if you in turn promise to not steal my things. And so now you both could agree to the same social contract that makes it a law that stealing is forbidden, that everyone has a right to his property. Maybe you both agree to this law begrudgingly. Maybe you both would prefer if the law made an exemption for just you and you could still steal from the other. But you both understand that the other would not accept that. And so, if you want your property to be secure, you have to accept that the other's property will also be secure and cannot be taken by you. And in that sense, while both particular wills in this example are evil, the common will of the whole that they form together is still good. And this is what is needed in the state, Kant would say. The sovereign must not make arbitrary laws, but rather his laws must represent the will of the whole people. Only then can they be just laws. And in that sense, the people, as I already said, must take part in the sovereignty, in the lawgiving. And in that sense, they must have independence or autonomy in the state. And a person within the state who has independence, by Kant, is called an active citizen. The active citizen is the independent citizen who takes part in the lawgiving. If you don't have independence, so if, according to the second criterion, you are a subject of the state, subjected to the state's force that forces you to obey the laws, but you are not an independent active citizen who takes part in the lawgiving, then you don't have what Kant calls civil personality. Of course, you have personality in other senses, in a psychological sense, in a moral sense, you're still a moral person. But in a civil sense, you have no personality of your own. And in this case, Kant says you are either a passive citizen, that is, someone who has citizenship of the state, but not the active citizenship, not the right to take part in the lawgiving. Here you can think nowadays of children, for example, that are citizens of their state, but not yet fully fledged active citizens. In Kant's day, of course, you can also think of women. Or you are what Kant calls a protected person. And that could be, for example, a foreigner, an immigrant, who lives in that state and is protected by the laws, like He's not just someone that anyone who wants can just kill on the spot. So he is a protected person, but he is not a citizen. He does not take part in the lawgiving. He does not have the independence. Kant would say that the first two criteria of the Republic should apply to all. So even to the passive citizens and to the protected persons. As human beings, they should only be subjected to laws they could have given to themselves, not to oppressive laws that take their freedom away. And as subjects of the states, they should be equal with everyone else. That is, it should be possible to force them through the state, but they should also have the right to force others to the state, right? The passive citizen, like the child, or back in the day, the woman, or the protected person, like the foreigner, are not without rights. They too, if they are attacked, if the law is broken and they are the victim, they too can go to court, can sue someone. But the third criterion of the Republic, the independence, the being an active citizen that takes part in the lawgiving, that is not necessarily a right that everyone must have, Kant says. He would say that independence is required not just for active citizenship, for taking part in the lawgiving, but he would say that independence, or as I said, a civil personality, is also required to represent yourself legally. So I just said that the second criterion of the Republic applies to everyone. Everyone is a subject, so also the passive citizens and protected persons must be able to force others through the state. But Kant would say that unlike the active citizens, they cannot be allowed to do so directly, but only through an active citizen representing them, which is what we still do in case of children, right? Like if a child is attacked, like if the child is physically abused by someone, or if the child is raped, the child will not represent himself in court, but rather his legal guardians, the parents or whoever else it is, will represent the child. Of course, when it comes to foreigners, we don't do this. The foreigner to whom an injustice was done can represent himself in court, despite, in Kant's sense, not having a civil personality, not being an active citizen. This Kant would probably call an inconsistency in our laws. Here he would probably say either you must give him citizenship, then he has if he has the independence to represent himself, he must also have the independence to take part in the lawgiving. Or if you say he does not have independence, he does not have civil personality, then just like the child, he must be represented by someone else. But the point is that at least through a representative, even the passive citizens and protected persons, as subjects of the state, must be able to force every other subject. But not being active citizens, they must not be able to take part in the lawgiving. You can say that according to the third criterion, the difference is this: that in the despotic state, people are subjected to other people, at least to one despot, maybe also to certain lords or masters that themselves are subjects to the despot. While in the Republic, at least the active citizens are not subjected to any other person, but rather they are only subjected to the whole, of which they themselves are part. So in a way, they are only subjected to themselves. And that is precisely why this subjection is not despotic. As a side note, to Kant, what matters especially here is the question of taxes. He would say that the state is despotic if it can just take part of your property away for its own or for the despot's own interests. No matter whether the despot is a single king, a single tyrant, or whether it's a bunch of oligarchs or whatever. But if they simply arbitrarily take people's money for their own goals, that is despotic. Rather, you have a republic if everyone who is paying taxes also takes part in the decision how does the system of taxes work, who has to pay how much taxes, and what is the tax money used for. If you are to give some of your property to the state, and if that is not supposed to simply be robbery, simply the state stealing your property, then that can only be if you yourself have agreed that this part of your property should benefit the whole for certain goals. So we can assume that Kant, based on this, would have agreed with the protest slogan of the American revolutionaries who protested against the British despotism, saying no taxation without representation. Because it was indeed despotic that Britain was taxing the colonies, but not allowing those people that it was taxing to also be represented in the British Parliament, and thereby also have a say in how and for what they would be taxed. So they were being only passive citizens despite being taxed. But I will also warn you, because we live in superficial times, and we live in times that basically from birth get people used to inconsistency, to never thinking things through, to never ask what really follows from a principle. And that is why often people, when initially hearing some principle, might agree because it sounds good, it sounds right, and it probably is right. But then, once you show them what actually necessarily would follow if you take that principle seriously, they might be surprised and shocked. Because in this case, if you really say no taxation without representation, if you really say this is despotic, this is robbery, it is only Republican if you can have a say in how you are taxed and what you are taxed for, then from that would follow that immigrants, that foreigners living in a state either must not be taxed till they acquire citizenship, or they must be given citizenship from the moment they are taxed. Right now, these things are completely disconnected, of course. So there are people that live in a certain state, maybe for years, maybe for decades, and maybe they work. And I'm not even talking about illegal immigrants, like even legal immigrants that work a regular job, and then they have to pay their taxes, and still they have no say in what happens to those taxes. Here where I live in a part of Berlin where lots of mainly Turkish and Arab immigrants live, and there is this one Turkish guy who has a small store here. This guy has, I think, lived here for like 50 years by now, and still, because he's no citizen, he has to pay taxes, but he cannot vote. And he's very dedicated to protesting about this. I think like once or twice a week he drives around with his bike and playing some music to make noise and carrying a poster. And he has been doing this since I was a child. So he is very dedicated. He certainly has worked harder for his right to vote than some random German whose only accomplishment is being born as a German. But still, he doesn't get the right to vote. And the thing is, most people are not even aware of that, but the thing is that as a German citizen, if you live outside of Germany for 25 years, you lose the right to vote. You regain it if you move back, but you lose it. But you don't gain the right to vote as a foreigner who lives in Germany for 25 years. And of course, German citizen laws are very racist anyways. In theory, your whole family can have lived here for generations and you can still not be a citizen. It's not like the US, where if you are born here, you automatically have a right to citizenship. Of course, that's getting changed too in the US. But rather here, it depends on blood. So if you don't have German blood, well, tough luck. You can have lived here 100 years with your family and still you would have to apply for citizenship, to pass some test. Then maybe they will ask you to confirm that you believe in the right of Israel, so a completely different state to exist. While on the other hand, if you have German ancestors, like they are the so-called Russlanddeutsche, so the Russia Germans, people whose ancestors moved from Germany to Muscovy like 200 or 300 years ago, and for all intents and purposes, they are Muscovites. Like they completely lost their former culture, their language. They speak Muscovian. And still, after the Cold War, they were allowed to come back to Germany. And to be clear, I don't have anything against them being here specifically, but I also don't have anything against Syrians or Afghan or Turkish people coming here. But I do have something against certain people being privileged because of their bloodline. And I don't see, I mean, it's a scandal that you can live here for many, many years, pay taxes, work, and still not be allowed to vote. And I don't see how anyone could possibly justify that except on ideological, nationalist, and racist grounds. Democratically, I don't see how this can be justified. Democratically, it's more rational to say no taxation without representation. But of course, our politicians are almost all of them populists. And the German constitution even says it is the task of the parties to take part in the people forming their will. So it doesn't say it's the task of the parties to just give the people what they want, but to help in shaping their will. But of course, these populist politicians, they don't do that. They just present themselves as serving the arbitrary, selfish, ideological interests of the people. So, of course, no politician is likely to propose changing such laws anytime soon because he will assume that he will gain more voters by making racist remarks against immigrants and not by supporting immigrants. But clearly, it follows from Kant's principle that if the state allows a foreigner to live here legally, to migrate here, and to work here, and if that foreigner is made to pay taxes, then he should also be given the citizenship of the state. As far as Kant is concerned, as I already said, he says that the first two parts of the Republic, the freedom of human beings as human beings, and the equality or the equal dependency on the state of subjects as subjects must apply to everyone. And just the third, the independence of the active citizens, the together taking part in the lawgiving, in the general will of the sovereign, only that does not apply to everyone. Well, Kant says, from the freedom and from the equality that must apply to everyone, it necessarily follows that everyone, meaning the passive citizens, meaning the protected persons, must at least have the chance to also become an independent, active citizen, to also acquire civil personality, right? Because so Kant is thinking here of, for example, the children who at first will not be allowed to vote, but as they grow older, as they become adults, they must have a chance to become active citizens that can vote. And he is also thinking of servants. So in his system, servants of a household would not be allowed to vote. I will get into that in a moment. But they should not be serfs that are eternally bound to their masters. They must have the possibility to end this job, to end this service, to acquire their own wealth, to become independent, and to then gain active citizenship. And even though Kant does not outright say so, this would also, of course, have to apply to foreigners, right? This would mean that if someone is a legal immigrant, of course, legal immigrants would maybe be another question, but if the state allowed someone to settle within its borders in the first place, if the state tolerates someone's presence, the state must also allow that same person to acquire citizenship if he wants. And while Kant does not, once again, apply his principle to the women, I would say that if you want to be consistent, it would have to apply to them too. So Kant says everyone can only be free and equal if everyone also has at least a chance to become an active citizen, taking part in the lawgiving. Then it means women also must have that chance. So once again, even though Kant himself did not go as far as to demand it, the emancipation of women does follow as a necessity from his philosophy, I would say. And it should be clear why the third follows from the other two principles. Because again, freedom, which should be for everyone, freedom means not being subjected to laws that you could not have given to yourself. Now, you could maybe have given yourself a law that bars you from voting under certain conditions. Like children themselves could maybe agree, okay, we are not ready to vote, we should not be allowed to vote. But you could not have given yourself a law that bars you from being able to vote under all conditions. So no child would ever agree that even if it grows up, it will never be allowed to take part in the voting. And likewise with the equality. I already said, according to Kant, our position in the state and the rights or duties we have should not depend on our birth, because that's not an active action, that's not a deed, it should only depend on our deeds. Well, this would then also have to go for the right to vote, right? Being a foreigner, being a servant, being I would say also a woman, being a child, um, should not keep me from active citizenship forever. I should be uh, allowed to acquire the right to vote through my deeds. If no matter what I do, I'm still not allowed to vote, then I'm not equal with others before the law. So the third criterion of the Republic demands that at least everyone who has independence, who has civil personality, has active citizenship, has the right to take part in the lawgiving. I will stress, however, that to Kant, this does not mean that everyone must directly take part in the lawgiving, that there must be something like direct democracy. Um, Indeed, Kant is against this. He says that this would be the most despotic of all systems, because here there could never possibly be a separation of powers. If the people voted directly, they could vote to banish someone or to kill someone, like in ancient Athens. And also, Kant believes that the people would easily be swayed by demagogues. Um, so Kant rather supports what he calls a system of representation, um, where the people don't choose the laws directly, but rather they are represented by certain people that choose the laws for them. Here, as in many other things, when it comes to his philosophy of right, Kant is inspired by the system that was in place in England at this time, and that in many ways he didn't think was perfect by any means, but that in many ways he thought was better than what they had in Prussia or in many other European states. So Kant says that any sovereign, and that includes the people in democracy, if the people are the sovereign, is the least likely to be despotic, to give unjust laws, if he doesn't give laws directly at all, but rather someone else who represents him gives laws in his stead and in his name. However, I would not be so fast as to interpret this as Kant simply being a supporter of the system we have now. I wouldn't be so fast in judging that Kant, if he were to see our politics today, our states today, would approve of that. Because nowadays, we mostly just have a nominal representation of the people. Our MPs hardly represent the people as such, hardly even try or even pretend to to represent the will of the whole, the general will, but rather, if they aren't just representing their own selfish interests, um, then at most they represent certain groups that voted for them. So, in our current system, one part of the population is always pitted against another part, right? Um, Politicians rise not even promising to make everything good for everyone, but rather promising certain people, certain groups to improve their lives or to keep their privilege at the expense of others. So, really, we have replaced the despotism of one despot with the despotism of changing majorities over changing minorities. Which in turn is held somewhat in check by constitutions that do have some republican elements, saying there are some basic rights that cannot simply be changed even by the despotism of a majority, but rather that are in place and will remain in place. And that you might consider progress as compared to Kant's day, but it is still very much far away from what he envisioned, from a system where we have people truly representing the people as such and truly representing not particular wills of individuals or groups or even majorities, but representing the universal will of the whole. When talking about this law giving, about this active citizenship, about this system of representation, it should also be noted that Kant has very restrictive, very limited system of suffrage in mind as compared to today. Because the third principle of the Republic, he calls the principle of the independence of the citizen, right? This, on the one hand, means that an active citizen should be independent, should be, able to take part in the lawgiving. But it also to him means, on the other hand, that only he who is independent in the first place should be an active citizen and lawgiver. So independence should be the requirement for suffrage. Now, what does independence mean to Kant in this context? Independence means that you should depend only on the state as a whole, but not on any particular part, not on any particular person in the state. You should, so to say, stand on your own 2 feet and have to answer to no one but the state authority as such. So this, of course, excludes children from voting, but on different grounds than today. Today we say children are not fit to vote because they are too immature. They don't have the capacity yet to understand what they are voting for. While to Kant, that is not the point, but rather the point is that simply they are still dependent on their parents. Which also would mean that in Kant's system, there wouldn't be a specific age, like 18-year-old, when you suddenly gain the right to vote. Rather, the state would have to check, is this person independent yet? Is he living off of his own income? Here, Kant is thinking first and foremost about people who belong to others according to the personal right in the manner of an item. This is something I discussed in my previous lecture on the different relations, the different types of right. Kant says there's item right, so the right to own an item. There's personal right, the right not to own a person, but to own certain actions of a person that person owes me according to a contract. And then there is this personal right in the manner of an item, which is the right to own a person, but not to own the person's actual person, the person's substance. That would be slavery, which Kant is against, but to own the state, to own the condition of that person. And this personal right in the manner of an item to Kant includes the wife who belongs to her husband. It includes the children who belong to their parent, and it includes the house servants who depend on the lord of the household. All of those have no civil personality in Kant's thinking. In the legal sense, of course not morally, but in the legal sense, they are not persons, they don't have their own substance, but rather they are accidents to another person. And for that very reason, they all, to Kant, are excluded from voting. Apart from those, there's also people excluded from voting because they don't live from their own property. Because that is the other criteria to Kant. Not only must you not depend on someone, not be bound to someone legally by this personal right in the manner of an item, you also must be able to live off your own property. Now, property, here is a term that Kant means and interprets in a very broad manner. So, to be sure, someone who lives off his own property could be someone who has his own piece of land and farms it and can sustain himself. It can also be someone who has amassed himself or inherited a certain amount of wealth and can live off of that. It can also be someone who works, but in that case, he must work with his own property. Kant says that if you have an art, a craft that you learned, or if you have certain knowledge, a certain science that you possess, and you live off of that by offering the service of your art or of your science to others, I mean, that's what Kant himself as a professor did, right? That also means you are living off your property and should therefore have the right to vote. But Kant says that, for example, day workers that work not on their own farm but are employed for a short time to work on another's farm, for example, they are not independent and therefore shouldn't have a right to vote. Or, for example, when it comes to craftsmen, Kant makes a distinction between a smith who is a proper established craftsman with his own workshop. And in his workshop, he creates certain items that then he sells. And on the other hand, there were small petty smiths that didn't have their own workshop, but rather they would come into someone's home, like they would advertise their work on the street, and then someone would call them to come to his home or to his farm to do small work there, maybe put horseshoes on a horse, and they would get paid for that. And those people, once again, Kant wants to exclude from voting. Because those, once again, he says, do not depend on, well, their own property. These parts of Kant's writing I find a bit unclear, a bit obscure. I find that Kant fails a bit to really make clear what his own principle is. That he is basing this on. It's easy to come away when reading this with the impression that this is a bit arbitrary. But I would say that there is a principle behind it. I mean, we should consider that for the longest time, this was not just Kant's opinion. Something along those lines for hundreds, if not thousands of years, was a very widespread opinion that if you have some sort of democracy, some sort of voting, it cannot apply to everyone. It cannot apply to dependent people. It cannot apply to super pure people. If we want to better understand it, maybe we should turn from Kant to some other thinkers. You might turn to Marx, for example, with his concept of labor power. So, talking in Marxian terms, you could maybe say that what Kant means is that those people should not get to vote who have nothing that they can sell and that they can live on, but their own labor power. So Kant would then want to exclude the workers, the proletariat in Marx terms, from voting. Here I point you back to my lecture on the innate and the acquired rights, according to Kant. Kant says that all the right is about the mine and yours, is about property. But he says that there is innate rights, so rights to that which is mine by birth, that would be my body. I have a right to autonomy of my body, to not be killed, to not be enslaved, and so on. So the basic human rights. And then Kant says there's acquired rights, so rights to things that became mine at some point, like my clothes, my bike, my house, everything that is not mine by birth, but that became mine. And maybe what Kant means is that you are only independent if you can live off of an acquired property. Once again, this could be physical property, like you acquired a farm and you can live off of that. It could also be, so to say, a mental property when you acquired an art, a craft, a science. But these two are things that you were not born with, but that you acquired. While on the other hand, what Kant seems to be saying to me is that if you depend on that which is yours by birth, so merely your body and the strength of your body, once again, going with Marx, we could say your mere labor force, then you are not independent and should not get to vote. We could also, if we better want to understand Kant's position, maybe turn to Hannah Arendt, who, talking about the vita activa, the active life, says there are three kinds of activity, of which the third, action, as in, for example, political action, does not concern us here. But the first two to her are laboring and working. Working to her means producing, creating a lasting product, contributing to the shared world that you share with other human beings, the world that is made up of the human artifice, not nature that is there without us and before us, but the world made up of human artifices, creating objects that might even outlast you, that might even be there beyond your death. That is working. While laboring, on the other hand, to Arendt, and here she is influenced by Marx, is simply the metabolism with nature. The laborer to her is someone who labors because the necessities of life demand it. So food production, for example, but also stuff like cleaning or doing renovating, doing repair work. That to her is labor, and it is characterized by not producing anything that lasts. Rather, the products of labor, be it food that is eaten, or be it a house that was cleaned and now it's made dirty again by people living in it, the products of labor are consumed more or less immediately. And if they aren't, they go bad anyways, right? The food will rot, the house will get dusty and full of spiders, even if no one lives in it. So therefore, labor has to constantly be repeated, while work at some point is done. The product is completed, and then you can work on something else. You can create a new product. Going with this, maybe we could also say that what Kant means here seems to be that people that work should maybe vote, but those people that have to labor shouldn't. And Kant says, Arendt says, this is how it has been for the longest time, right? Since labor is dictated by nature, by the necessity of life. For the ancient Greeks, for example, those who labored were excluded from politics. And that was those who labored for the survival of the individual, the slaves, making sure we, the living individuals, now have food today. And also those who labored for the survival of the species, meaning the women who go into the labor of birth, both as being subjected to the necessities of life, were not allowed to take part in politics, right? Rather, the free men, the free citizens, were free precisely because others labored for them, because they had not to labor themselves, rather they had slaves doing that for them. And this is an attitude that stayed in place for the longest time. I mean, even in more modern times, people that merely labored, that merely sold their own body or their own body's labor force, were excluded from politics, were excluded from voting. Like we are used to consider the First World War a clash between empires, Germany, Austria, the Ottomans, and democracies, the US, Great Britain, France. But we tend to forget that many of those soldiers fighting on the side of those democracies could also not vote. It is just after the First World War, and also because of the First World War, that the common workers in France or in Great Britain gained the right to vote. So it seems to be this centuries or even millennia old sentiment that is behind Kant's judgment, saying that I think what Kant is saying is that those who don't work but just labor, those who don't live off a property that they acquired, so who don't live off, you could say, something that legally is their accident, but who have to sell their own substance, who live off their own body and its own power, those should be excluded from voting. Now, this system, basing the right to vote on your independence, on you first not being sort of owned and in the custody of another, and second, not being not living off you selling just your own natural labor power and therefore being dependent on someone that may employ you, but rather you living off your own acquired property, whatever it may be. This system certainly has interesting implications. It would mean, on the one hand, for the legal immigrant, for the foreigner, as I already said, that he could not live here for years or decades without being allowed to vote. Rather, if someone like that lives here and lives here independently, like having built his own business maybe, then he would automatically have to acquire the right to vote. Also, for the children, And this implies that there is not a specific age, like 18, where you suddenly just gain the right to vote, but rather the state would have to check whether you are independent or not. So someone could, in theory, become independent sooner. Maybe there's a 16-year-old who already moves out, already earns his own money, once again, maybe created his own business or whatever. Uh, then that 16-year-old would have to gain the right to vote. But on the other hand, what would certainly happen more often is that people for many more years after they already turned 18 maybe still live at home or still are dependent on their parents supporting them, while, for example, they still go to university and are not working themselves yet, and therefore would not yet have the right to vote. Now, of course, it is likely that many people nowadays would disagree with Kant here, would say that voting should not be this restricted, that many people should not be kept away from voting. But as always, when a philosopher is criticized, I would warn people not to do so hastily. Because usually when people hear, oh, a philosopher said this or that, and then they immediately disagree, that disagreement is worthless because it just means whatever the philosopher says goes against what I have believed so far. And in most cases, that means just it goes against the currently held prejudices of this society. Well, but what if those are wrong? And the philosopher, in this case Kant, is right. No, we have to actually get into the specific philosophy, and we have to ask, why does the philosopher say this? What is the principle that makes him arrive at this specific position? And once we identified the principle, there are two possibilities if we assume the philosopher is wrong. That is, either that the principle as such is wrong, or alternatively, that the principle might be right, um, but the principle is misapplied. So first off, Kant's principle. Kant does say you must be independent in order to be an active citizen, in order to have a civil personality, in order to be allowed to vote. Um, and I think it's clear that a reason for that is that if you are dependent and you have a right to vote, you cannot really vote freely, right? Uh, because once again, you are dependent on someone. So that someone could sort of force you or blackmail you, pressure you um, into voting in his interest, right? Um, the husband of the wife, not speaking of today's world where the wife is probably independent, probably has her own job, but in Kant's time, the husband of the wife um, can more or less force the wife to vote in his interest. The parents could more or less force the child to vote in their interest. Likewise, the let's say the capitalist, let's say the factory owner, um, with the workers who are completely dependent on him because they only have their own labor power to sell to him. Um, Now, if they were to vote for something that is in their interest, like for a shorter workday or for better minimum wage or whatever, um, the factory owner could threaten them with firing them, with unemployment. And this would maybe be not something that you could threaten an independent farmer with, or that you could threaten an independent craftsman with his own workshop with, but you could threaten the worker with that. So I think Kant's concern is that if we give dependent people a vote, what we are really doing is giving the person whom they depend on two votes, which of course would be unfair. And I mean, you should also consider what is the whole basis for Kant's philosophy of right, which I discussed in my lecture on his theory of the ground and of original acquisition, and also in my lecture on why there should even be a state. Kant envisions the state of nature, where there is no state, no laws. And in this state of nature, you can acquire property. And this starts, Kant would say, with the ground. You can claim a piece of ground for yourself, and then whatever is on or in that ground, the trees that grow there that you might hack down for their wood, or the animals that live on that ground that you might hunt, or the crops that you might harvest from that ground, or the metals that you might dig up from that ground, whatever is from that ground also belongs to you, but simply because, first of all, the ground belongs to you. And in this state of nature, anyone can own as much ground and whatever is on it as he can defend. So, sure, you could claim miles up and miles up and miles to be your land. But even if you're the strongest person on earth, you cannot be everywhere at the same time. So, there's really nothing you can do if people get on what you claim to be your land and start building their own hut there. So, you can only claim a um, certain amount of land, and beyond that you are really powerless when people claim a piece of land for themselves. But the issue in this state of nature is, of course, that there is no guarantee that others will accept your property. So you can, for example, claim a piece of land, you can maybe build a fence around it, but of course others could climb over that fence or tear it down and start attacking your property, start stealing your things, which is precisely why it would be rational to enter with these others into a social contract and to agree to form a state with laws that gives you, all of you, a guarantee of your property, and that enforces these guarantees, that protects your property. So what all of this means, and again, in these previous lectures, I talked about the theory of Kant in more detail, but what all of this means is that Kant basically starts envisioning people that in the state of nature already are independent. They already are living off their own property that they acquired, a piece of land where they hunt, where they farm, whatever. And now, as independent owners of property, they come together to form a state that will confirm them in their property and that will protect this property. And so it makes sense that in this state they build together, they also get to work. But now imagine someone in this state of nature who has not taken a piece of land for himself of which he can live, but rather who lives on land that someone else claimed for himself, being tolerated on that land, and maybe being tolerated because he works for that other person, farming the land for him. Now, when the social contract is made, when people form a state, why should the person tolerating this guy on his land and employing this guy, let him have a vote. All that they want, the whole reason why they come together to form a state in the first place, is because they want a guarantee for their property that they claim for themselves. And they get this guarantee by affirming the others in the property that those others claim for themselves. But here we have a person who has claimed no property. So there is nothing we have to give him. There's nothing we have to affirm him in. And so there's also nothing that he can really give us. And so it makes sense that this guy would now not have a say in the contract that is made. So what I'm saying by this is that Kant's basic principle does make sense, and saying only independent people should vote, those who depend on others shouldn't, because they would depend on those others and it would just give those others several votes. But now the question is, even if the principle is correct, what about the way it is applied? And here I would say you could take the same principle that Kant has, but you could apply it differently and therefore arrive at another result. Let's consider women. So Kant says only independent people should vote. In the society that I live in, 18th century bourgeois society, women depend first on their fathers and then on their husbands, so they shouldn't be allowed to vote. I agree. I actually agree. I agree that under the conditions back then, it would not have made sense to let women vote. But my argument would be, reason says all people, including women, are equal. Reason therefore demands that all have the right to vote. So if women cannot vote because they are dependent, reason demands that we make women independent, that we make sure women can have property, women can learn a craft or a science, women can work, so that they can be as independent as men and thereby earn their right to vote. So while for Kant this would be an argument against letting women vote, for me it would precisely be an argument for the emancipation of women. All I would say is that historically, the emancipation of women went in the wrong order chronologically, because women gained the right to vote before they became independent. Now I'm speaking for the German perspective here, but I'm assuming in other countries things were somewhat similar. In Germany, women got the right to vote after the First World War with the Weimar Republic, relatively early compared to many other countries. But for a long time, they in many regards had less rights than men. Not just in the Weimar Republic, but even after the Second World War, in the Federal Republic. So, for example, for a long time, a married woman could not go work without her husband's approval. My grandma still needed her husband's approval for working. If the husband said no, the woman's work takes up too much time and energy, and therefore she cannot fulfill her duties in the household anymore, then the woman was not allowed to work. Likewise, without the husband's approval, they could not open a bank account or sign a contract, even something very minor. So here in Germany, when at the end of the school year, the students get a diploma with their grades of that year, the parents have to sign it to show that they took note of it, that the child showed them the grades and that they know how the child is doing in school. Back in the day, my grandpa had to sign that. Even something so minor my grandma's signature was not good enough for. And these things were changed in the decades after World War II, like in the 60s or in the 70s. But then it took up until the late 90s to prohibit rape within marriage. Till then, in Germany, it was perfectly legal to rape your own wife. Rape was only illegal if it was committed towards someone you were not married to. Of course, all of these things were unconstitutional because the constitution from the start, so after World War II, the Constitution of the Federal Republic said that men and women are equal, but in fact, there were many laws that made them unequal. Now, during this whole time, women could already vote. I would say that wasn't rational. According to reason, it should rather have gone the other way around. So first, women should have gotten the right to work, to open a bank account, to not be raped by their husband. And then, but then also immediately, not years or decades later, with that, they should also, now being independent, have gained the right to vote. But of course, I'm very much aware, and so is Kant, I already discussed that in the lecture on what is justice, that actual history, actual human progress does not go according to reason. So it is one way how reason demands things to go, how things would go if everything was perfectly rational. And it is another way how it actually goes. And it actually can't go in the rational way always, because that would imply that people already are rational and not in the process of becoming rational. It is good to think about these things, to think about what would be rational, to become more reasonable, but one should be aware that actual history rarely takes the course of reason. But again, my main point is we can agree with Kant that as long as women depend on men, they should not vote. But unlike Kant, we can use that precisely as an argument for their emancipation, saying, well, they should have the right to vote, however, since no one should vote that is dependent, they should therefore be made independent. Now, as for others, like the workers, the proletariat, here too, I think Kant has a point. If you are dependent and you get to vote, then your vote is not free. It depends on the person you depend on. But I would say this could be a great argument for implementing an unconditional basic income, which of course is something that Kant does not discuss, but that nowadays in our time more and more gets discussed and suggested. If everyone got an income through the state, then everyone would automatically be independent because they could live off that acquired property that the state hands out to them. And sure, they could still work on top of that. They could still get employed somewhere to make some more money, but that would not make them dependent. They would be independent. And you should not think that this is the same, that because someone could argue, isn't that still dependency? Now you made the person dependent on the state and not on his employer, but he's still dependent on someone giving him money. Well, yes, but let's not forget that Kant's principle is you can get to vote if you depend on no specific individual or group within the state, but only on the state, only on the whole as such. if the state as such, and not your employer, hands out money to you, there's no specific person on whom you are dependent and who could influence your vote. Rather, since you yourself are part of the state, since you yourself are now an active citizen and part of the lawgiver, you yourself take part in making or unmaking the law that gives out a basic income, or that decides how high or how low the basic income should be. Really, and you also take part in the laws about taxes. So in the laws that first get the state the money that it needs to hand out basic income. So you could say that really here, in a way, you are only dependent on yourself. You yourself take part in this decision saying everyone should contribute part of his income to the whole, and it should then by the whole be redistributed to everyone so that everyone is independent of other people. So this, I think, would make a great argument for basic income. And this way we could use Kant's own principle and agree with Kant's own principle, but still everyone, the women, the workers, could get to vote. Now, as for foreigners, that would depend. That would have to be another discussion. Should they too get that basic income? In that case, they would also have to get the right to vote. Or should they not get the basic income till they themselves became independent? In that case, a foreigner would automatically acquire the right to vote as soon as he can live off his property. And with that, he would also then acquire the right to basic income, which now he would probably not need, already living off his property, but would be a nice bonus. And as for the children, well, here too, it would have to depend on additional laws about when to give out the basic income, right? We could make a law that maybe children are exempt from it, that maybe you only get the basic income starting with a certain age. In that case, you could still exclude children from the vote, but once again, you would have to make an exception for those children that manage to somehow gain independence, that somehow live off their own property sooner than others, sooner than that age you set for the basic income. But that would be Kant's principle for the right to vote, for the system of suffrage. To conclude what was said so far, a republic to Kant is defined by three principles. Everyone as a human being must have freedom, must only be subject to laws he could have given himself. Everyone as a subject of the state must equally depend on the state and equally be able to force others through the state as they are able to force him. And everyone who has gained independence, that is, who can live off his own acquired property, must also be an independent active citizen of the state, that is, must take part in the sovereignty, in the legislation of the state, at least through a representative, meaning the laws must be such as represent not the will of a particular despotic person or group, but the will of the whole. So you could say that a republic is a state where the laws are such as could stem from everyone, as apply to everyone or are given for everyone, and as are given by everyone or through everyone. Or you could also say, and this I already mentioned in the earlier lecture on what is justice, that the republic must have the elements of freedom, of force, and here Kant now specifies it must be equal force. The law must be enforced equally for everyone. And law. And here now Kant specifies it must be not a random, arbitrary, despotic, oppressive law, but rather a law representing the will of the whole, a law given, so to say, by the people for the people. These are the three criteria. It should be obvious also that Kant here used his architectonic method, that Kant here is following the three categories of relation. You could say the first category, that of substance and accident, demands that every person in the state as a human being must be its own substance, not just an accident of a state, must in that sense be free. According to the second category, that of causality or dependency, the demand is that everyone equally be a subject, everyone equally be dependent on the state and on the state's laws. And according to the third category, that of community, the demand is that the whole community of the people, of the active citizens, of the independent people in the state together be the lawgiver, not just the law being given by some particular will. I want to point out that depending on what text of Kant's you're reading, the terms used for these three principles are sometimes changing. The first principle is pretty consistently named that of freedom. As human beings, we should be free in the state. As for the second principle, there's a place where Kant calls it the dependency of the subjects of the state. But then in another text, he calls it the principle of equality of the subjects before the law. And as for the third principle, there is a text where Kant calls it the principle of the independence of the citizens in the state. But then at another point, Kant calls this principle the principle of equality of the citizens in the process of lawgiving. So particularly the name equality, switching between the second and the third principle, might be confusing. But that does not mean that the principles as such changed. If you are not sticking to the words and letting the words, the names confuse you, but if you stick to the actual concepts behind the words, to the actual content of what Kant is thinking here, you will find that he is very consistent between different writings. So the second principle is always that everyone should be under the law and should be able to force everyone else through the law. And the third principle is always that everyone should take part in the law giving, and that the laws should represent the whole, not just a particular. It's just that you could choose to call both a principle of equality, right? According to the second principle, people are equal before the law, equally subjected to the law. According to the third principle, they are equal in that they equally give the law and every vote counts equally. This is a good example, I think, to show that words are not the same as concepts. Words are just sort of symbols that we use to point at certain concepts. And the same concept can be given through different words, and different concepts can be given through the same word. So it is very important, if you really want to learn to think independently and critically, if you really want to become aufklärt, to learn to be independent of words and to grasp the concepts behind it. And especially when you're dealing with Kant, who is such a systematic, such an architectonic thinker, that means grasping his architectonic system. Because once again, those two principles follow the three categories of relation. So while the naming may change, the specific place that each principle takes within the architectonic remains the same. But back to the naming. So far, I've only given names that appear in Kant's published works. If you go to his private notes, there are even more different names for the principles, particularly for the third principle. You will find it named the principle of the unity of will, and also the principle of the brotherly unity or the brotherly unification of the people, or the fraternal unification, maybe you could say. And now let us consider the names of these three principles again. The first one is consistently called the principle of freedom. Then you have the name equality, which sometimes is applied at some point to the third principle, but more regularly Kant applies it to the second principle. And then you have the third principle, sometimes called that of independence, sometimes that of equality, also that of unity, but at least in one note, also called that of brotherly or fraternal unification. And now, especially when you consider that Kant was working on these thoughts in his late philosophy, in the 1790s, when the French Revolution of 1789 had already started, and Kant was a great supporter of that revolution, was very enthusiastic about it. Now you should realize that this is the slogan of the French Revolution, right? Liberté, égalité, fraternité. So liberty or freedom, equality, and fraternity or brotherhood. The three principles of Kant are freedom, equality, and brotherly unity. So Kant is basically saying this is what makes a true republic, and so in that sense the French are right to use that slogan. However, it must be noted that only if you understand brotherhood or fraternity in this sense, that is in a legal, in a juridical sense, people being brothers because they are unified into one lawgiver, one common general will of the whole, that gives the law for the whole brotherhood, only then does it become the principle of a proper republic. There is a great danger with using the word brotherhood or fraternity to understand it more in an ethical sense, not a unity of the lawgivers, but rather a unity of attitudes, of mindset, everyone actually having the same inner will. And this is, of course, not a given. And to demand it, I would say, would be a very sure way into fascism. If you demand everyone to actually think and feel the same, to be brothers at heart, not only in the outer actions, this will lead to you enforcing that and to probably killing off anyone who is not a brother, which is precisely what happened to the French Revolution. So Kant, you could say, is here using his typical method of reading and interpretation. I already discussed it in the lecture on what and how should you read. Kant says if you read a philosopher's work, you should not ask what did he consciously mean, what did he consciously want to say, but rather what should he have wanted to say. What did reason, when it inspired him, want to say through him? So how can we interpret his words to be as rational as possible? So the task is to possibly understand a writer better than he understood himself. And this to me seems what Kant is doing here with the French revolutionaries. He's not necessarily saying that this is what they had in mind when talking of liberty, equality, and fraternity, but that this is what reason has in mind when uttering this slogan. This is what you should have in mind. This is what it should mean when you are talking about a republic. But the term brotherly or fraternal unity or unification for the third principle is only used by Kant in a private note. So maybe this might be precisely because Kant found that here, when it comes to the third term, the slogan of the French Revolution is a bit imperfect or could very easily be misinterpreted in dangerous ways. And maybe that's why Kant chose for his published works to apply another term, to rather talk about the principle of independence. Maybe, however, it's also because of the censorship back then. Maybe by talking about freedom, equality, or also at some point dependence and independence, instead of talking about freedom, equality, and brotherly unity, Kant wanted to make his support and approval of the French Revolution a bit less obvious to better pass the censorship that was in place in Prussia at the time. That is something I cannot say. All I can say is that this term, fraternal unity, only appears in a private note. And therefore, when you read Kant, it is, of course, easy to miss that these three principles basically represent the three principles of the French Revolution. But that is what is to say about the three principles that distinguish the Republic from the despotic state. Once again, according to his architectonic method, Kant deduces them from the three categories of relation. You can also find in Kant's writing him explaining the Republic according to all four classes of categories. However, usually he goes with the three principles I discussed in great detail. This is his usual definition of the Republic, but you can also find him following the not the three categories of relation, but the four different types of categories there are. There he would say that first, according to the quantity, the laws in a republic must be such as are given by one for all, and at the same time by all for one. And I would say that this is the same as the aforementioned third principle that corresponds to the category of community, the principle of independence of the citizens, or the principle of the unity of will, or the principle of fraternization, or whatever you want to call it. Precisely that principle that all together must be lawgivers and the laws must represent the will of the whole. Secondly, according to the quality, Kant says the laws in the Republic must be laws that don't serve the happiness of one or many or even of all, but rather they must be laws of freedom, laws that secure everyone's freedom, and not just right now, but also that secure their own permanent existence and therefore that secure freedom permanently. This, of course, this principle of the quality of the law corresponds with the first of the aforementioned three principles, the one belonging to the category of substance, the principle of freedom. When it comes to relation, Kant says in a republic the laws should be laws that only concern the actions of human beings towards other human beings. So that excludes the actions towards myself. In ethics, Kant says there are ethical duties towards others and also ethical duties towards myself. I gave a lecture about those ethical duties towards myself. Kant would say a moral person does not only not harm the freedom, the dignity, the autonomy of others, but also not of himself. So harming yourself, committing suicide, getting wasted on drugs, getting drunk, anything that is undignified and that threatens your freedom is an immoral action, Kant would say. But this does not concern the state. So there cannot be a law against suicide. I mean, how would you punish it anyways, with the death penalty? And there also cannot be a law against personal drunkenness, for example, or personal drug use. Of course, there can be laws, for example, against drunkenness while driving, because that threatens others. But if you want to get drunk in your own home alone, that is really your own problem, right? So duties towards myself are ethical duties, but they should not be put into law. That would be despotic. And also duties towards God, if there is such a thing, are not what concerns the laws of the Republic. So in a republic, I should not be made to pray, for example, or to keep the Sabbath, or to follow any other commandments that God may have given. This criterion you will, of course, not find under the three principles I mentioned before. And I mean, it's clear that here, where we have four principles, this cannot map perfectly onto the other definition of the Republic, where we have three principles, right? And maybe you could say that this criterion of relation is not really a principle of what makes specifically a republic, but rather it's more of a principle of the right as such, right? This distinguishes the right from ethics, that the right is only concerned with what I do to other human beings, not what I do to myself or what I do to God. We can, however, maybe say that this is also a principle of republicanism in that sense that the republic is the proper state, and that if a state does not understand its own task as a state, but rather if a state tries to also enforce ethics or religion, it will necessarily turn into a despotic state. Well, and the fourth principle in this definition of the republic, the one that corresponds to the categories of modality, is that Kant says there mustn't be arbitrary laws. The laws must be necessary laws. So if a law serves some arbitrary purpose, that the lawgiver or that certain people, certain groups in the state may or may not have, but that not necessarily the whole has, then it's a despotic law. Like, once again, a law that serves the purpose of a certain faith, that um, enforces that faith, or a law that serves the purpose of a certain established group, like conservatives saying they want to preserve their culture, their values, their way of life. Well, so what if others want to have different values or a different way of life? Um, those, even if the purpose is happiness, once again, that would be paternalistic, that would still be despotic. The laws must only be laws that are necessary in order to preserve reason's purpose, and reason's purpose is freedom. So again, prohibiting murder or theft or so on, that is necessary to make sure people stay free. Um, Other arbitrary purposes are not necessary. Maybe you could say that this somewhat fits with the second principle of the other definition. It doesn't quite map onto one another, but if you um, interpret it in this way, saying that, well, if you are a subject only to the state as such, then you are only subjected to the laws that are necessary to keep freedom. While if you are also subject to specific lords or masters within the state, then you are subject to someone's arbitrary purposes. If you somewhat interpret it like this, then those two principles could map onto each other. What I will point out when it comes to this last principle, saying that the modality of the laws must be such that they are not arbitrary, only possible laws serving arbitrary purposes, but rather they must be necessary. Kant would say, I mean, I already said earlier, in a true republic, at least the good person will feel free. At least the good person will not feel the law. Only an evil person would feel restricted. Kant would say that you live in a republic if all laws are rational, that is, if you can understand the reasoning behind every law. Already in my lecture on what is reason, I said that reason to Kant is, since it's the faculty of principles, is also the faculty of justification, meaning my actions or my convictions are rational if I can justify them, if I can explain why I do what I do or why I believe what I believe. And so the state's actions, the laws in the state, are rational and therefore republican if they can be justified, if the state can rationally explain, we made this law for this and that reason. And if I myself am rational, if I'm an aufklärt person who understands that reason, then I will gladly and voluntarily submit to such a law, right? If someone explains to me, well, we are prohibiting you from drinking while driving because it has been clearly shown that when you are drunk, you cannot drive safely and you might cause harm to others and also yourself, of course. Then I can understand that and I will say, okay, yeah, now I wouldn't want to drink and drive even if it wasn't forbidden. This law is indeed rational. On the other hand, you live in a despotic state if there are laws that cannot be rationally justified, so you yourself cannot understand why they would have to be in place. Like if the state tells you you mustn't be gay, you mustn't, as a man, have sex with other men, you can ask why, and there's no proper justification that can be given. I mean, sure, they will try to give some justification saying, I don't know, this causes harm to children somehow or whatever, but clearly there is no proper explanation for why this law should be in place. And so here in this state, if you follow this law, you are not following your own insight. And that is what freedom means to Kant. I explained that in my lecture on freedom. Freedom means I follow my own insight. I do something because I understood that it is right. Well, in a despotic state, you are not following your own insight. You are only obeying the law because you're forced to, because the state is stronger than you. That is, of course, a dictatorship. That is, of course, despotism. And that is not much different from the state of nature, where also you have a war of all against all and a rule of the strong eventually. Well, the state is the strongest, and the despotic state just abuses its strength to force you to do something which you would never do voluntarily because it makes no sense to you. In a republic, the laws make sense to you, so you would follow them voluntarily. And this, I will point out, to Kant is true not just in the legal realm, but also in the realm of religion. I will talk about this in more detail in some weeks or months when I get to his philosophy of religion, but I can say it already here now. What most people believe in, Kant would not call religion, he would call it paganism. Because to him, paganism is not defined by having many gods instead of one, or by making statues and images of your god instead of praying to an invisible god, but rather paganism or idolatry is defined by thinking that God is not rational, but rather imagining God like some heavenly dictator, some heavenly despot. Many people believe in a God that would throw you into hell, even if you have been the most good, the most holy, the most just person who ever lived, just because you didn't pray enough, or just because you didn't fast during a certain arbitrarily chosen month, or just because you had gay sex, even though it was loving and completely consensual, maybe. And such a God is not God. Such a God is a tyrant, is a despot. And the problem with such religious commandments, of course, is that we cannot possibly understand them. If I ask, why must I pray 5 times a day? Why isn't 4 enough? Or why shouldn't I rather be 6? Or if I ask, why mustn't I be gay? Or why mustn't I have sex without a marriage certificate? Or why mustn't I eat certain foods? Like, why mustn't I mix milk and meat or whatever? The only answer that those believers can give me is because God said so, because some prophet wrote it down in some book. Yeah, but why did God say so? I want a reason. I am a rational being. I deserve, this is part of my dignity, to not have to blindly and mindlessly follow some arbitrary authority, but rather I deserve to be given reasons. And I deserve to only have to follow something that makes sense. So such a God is a despot and therefore not a God. And that is therefore idolatry or paganism, that is anthropomorphism, imagining that God is as arbitrary and as particular as a human being. True religion, to Kant, imagines God as completely rational and therefore is only giving such commandments as I can understand, as make sense to me. And those are, of course, the moral commandments, like you shall not murder, you shall not steal. And therefore, actual religion to Kant is not so much about doing cult acts, like cult acts like praying or going to the church or mosque or synagogue or temple or whatever, or going on pilgrimages or fasting or not eating certain food, but rather actual religion is simply doing your moral duties as if they were given by a holy lawgiver. Actual religion to Kant is just conscientiousness, about which I already gave a lecture. Conscientiousness just meaning to Kant that you truly that you do something that you truly are sure is the right thing, that you are sure you could defend even in front of God. You could say to God, if this was wrong, then throw me into hell because I'm so sure that it was right. This is conscientiousness, and acting like this is true religion. Imagining God to be some despot that gives arbitrary laws is irreligious, is idolatry. But again, I will get into this topic more when I discuss Kant's philosophy of religion. Now, after having thus defined the republic as opposed to despotism, according to either the three principles following the categories of relation, or according to the four principles following the four different types of categories, I just want to stress again that to Kant, republic and despotism, and as I said, I would add fascism as a third, are forms of government, and this is something different from the form of state or the form of rulership as laid down in the Constitution. And that is why Kant says a state can be despotic according to its constitution. So according to the rights that the constitution gives to the ruler in theory, and yet still that according to his rights, despotic ruler can choose to govern in a republican manner. Which is what Kant said happened in Prussia in his time under Frederick II, Frederick the Great. He was, of course, according to the laws, the Constitution of Prussia, an absolute monarch. That is, he could have governed in a despotic manner if he chose to. But what mattered most to Kant is that this king lifted censorship, particularly when it came to matters of religion. And this was a Republican act. This was giving the people freedom. Now, of course, he could have taken it away at any moment, as proved by the fact that as soon as he died and Frederick William II rose to power, it was indeed taken away. Censorship was reinstalled. This I discussed more in the lecture on Kant's life, on his biography. But still, while the state was despotic, giving the king despotic power, it was possible for a king not to use this power, in a despotic manner. So Kant says that a government that does it right can have despotic powers, but give the people the opinion that they are free, because it doesn't oppress them with those powers. To Kant, ultimately, the republic is mainly the system of the representation of the will of the people that is one with itself. But this representation does not necessarily have to be done by actually elected representants, but rather the will of the people can also be represented by a despot who chooses to represent it and thereby not be a despot. Indeed, Kant even says that the higher the level of representation, that is, the fewer people represent the more people. And of course, the highest level of representation you would have in an absolute monarchy where one person represents everyone else, um, the more easy it is, or the more likely it is, to, at least over time, eventually reform the state and turn it more and more into a republic, right? Because if you have one monarch with despotic power, sure, he can use it to be a tyrant, but he could also use it to bring about great reforms, like just ending serfdom or slavery or whatever, because he chooses to. While if you have a lower level of representation, if you have more um, people representing the people, like a big parliament, then you have people representing different interests and having to make compromises, and then actual progress can actually be slower, which is maybe something we can see nowadays. Nowadays, we have these democratic parliaments, and what we can witness over the last years and decades is that there has been almost no legal progress anymore. There has been social progress, maybe, um, but progress, like real radical reform of the system to make it more just, at this point seems to have become almost impossible, um, because no one has enough power, even if he wanted to institute such a reform. So while such despotic powers can be dangerous, they can also be helpful. They are like a two-edged sword. But anyways, in absolutism, you can still have a republic, if not according to the letter of the law, then at least a republic in spirit, in the way the state is governed, which would mean that the people don't have autocracy, they don't themselves rule, but they do have autonomy. They give, or at least their representative who um, gives the law in their stead, as they, if they had the power to do so, and if they were aufklärt, if they were rational, would have given the law. And likewise, the other way around, you can easily imagine a democracy that still isn't a republic, um, which in large parts is what we have nowadays. You may have parliaments that are supposed to represent the people, but that still, at least largely, somewhat being restricted by a constitution, rule in a despotic, in an arbitrary, in a self-interested, non-rational manner. At the end of the day, as I already said, what matters very much to Kant for a republic is that you have a clear separation of powers, specifically of the legislative and executive power, so that the ruling and the governing are separated, and so that it is possible to govern independently of the ruler and the laws he makes, and to govern in a republican manner. But what really matters is how is governed. So you can say you have a system, you have a constitution where there's no clear separation of those powers, like an absolute monarch that is both the ruler and the governor of his state, both the legislative and executive power, or like a pure direct democracy, where the people vote directly. Um, but still, while such a system would be despotic according to its constitution, at least in theory, it would be possible, and this would actually be more likely in the absolute monarchy than in the direct democracy, um, that the sovereign chooses, despite the powers not being separated, um, to rule in a rational, in a republican manner. But while such a ruler who, despite his despotic rights and powers, chooses to govern in a republican manner, deserves praise, to Kant, this is not enough. Because a truly good constitution of a state is one that guarantees consistency and permanence to the form of government, he says. So this is, for example, why Kant criticizes Rome. He says, sure, there were some good emperors like Titus or Marcus Aurelius that did govern in a republican manner, but then after them what followed was a Domitian or a Commodus, and there was nothing they did or they could have done to prevent that. And as I said, the same happened in Prussia in Kant's own days. He says Frederick II was a good republican king, but then Frederick William II was again a despot who or in whose name Kant was censored for his writings on religion. Again, this I explained in the lecture on Kant's life. So Kant would say that surely the great monarchs that do good for their people, that rule justly, that rule in a republican manner, they get the greatest glory in history. But he says the greatest merit, even if they may not be glorified so much later, the greatest merit have those who manage to create a lasting constitution. A constitution that ensures that the state being governed in a just and republican manner does not depend on the whims of the respective ruler and could change any day, but rather a constitution that ensures that the state stays republican no matter who rules. So even if a bad, a fickle, an unjust, or an incompetent ruler takes charge, takes the sovereignty for a time, the constitution should render him somewhat harmless. And that is what we need to achieve, such a constitution, Kant would say. This is also what to him patriotism means. Not what is understood by that nowadays. Nationalism, pride in your country, all that nonsense. No, you are a patriot if you serve the whole, if you serve the rule of law, if you serve the justice of your country. That is, you are a patriot if you try to make sure that the constitution stays in place, that the republican form of government stays the same and is not changed when the sovereignty passes from one sovereign to the next. And here, once again, we should not simply assume that the issue is just with the form of rulership, so that the problem is monarchy and all is solved if we have democracy. Rather, the problem still is there in a democracy. In a democracy too, if the constitution allows for it, it is possible that the sovereign changes a republican, or at least a somewhat, or at least a more republican system into a despotic system. That is what happened when in Germany the Nazis were voted into power. I mean, it's not like they took power in a coup. They were voted. They got the majority of the votes. And in our days, again, we could and can witness such a thing. We could see that with the rise of Putin in Moscow. We could see that with the rise of Erdogan in Turkey, with the rise of Netanyahu in Israel, as well as of Hamas in Gaza. We could see that in Europe with the rise of Orban. We could see it in the US with the rise of Trump, or in Brazil with the rise of Bolsonaro. And to be sure, Bolsonaro was voted out again. Likewise, in Poland, we also for a time had a right-wing despotic government that was voted out again, which of course may be good for the time being, but, and this the example of the US has shown, where Trump was voted in, then out, and now in again, this is not good enough. As long as the constitution allows for a despotic government to return, there still is an issue with the constitution that would need to somehow be fixed. Living in a republic or in a despotism should not depend on coincidence and good or bad luck, but ideally the constitution should be such that the sovereign, whether it's a monarch, a senate of aristocrats, or the people, cannot do much harm, even if maybe he would like to. And this Kant wants to achieve through the separation of powers, namely of legislative and executive power, through the system of representation as opposed to direct law giving, and through the independence of the executive, of the administration, of the government from the legislator, that allows them to, yes, execute the orders of the legislator, but interpret it in their own, ideally rational manner, and thereby maybe render bad orders, bad laws more harmless. Something which they should also be pushed into doing, not just out of their own goodwill, but also by the threat of being judged and held accountable for their actions. This I have discussed in the previous lecture on the separation of powers and the sovereignty. Now, to conclude, Kant was for a republic. He did not push for immediate republicization. Kant was very skeptical about revolutions. I will get into that in its own lecture on why Kant said that revolutions are unjust. And also Kant even said that maybe in some instances despotism is needed for a while. So for example, he would say that one despotic absolute monarch can better defend the country against outside threats than some parliament can. And so if a country is surrounded by a number of other countries that are all despotic and threatening its existence, then it might not be a smart move to abolish the monarchy right in that instant. Maybe it's good to have the monarch as a sort of warlord for a time till the country has achieved a more peaceful state. Also, if you go through Kant's writings, especially his notes, he seems not entirely opposed to having a monarch at all. At some points, he says that a mixed system, like maybe in ancient Rome and like in his time in England, is the best system. There are instances where it seems that he envisions a monarch not as the sovereignty being with the people, with a democratically elected parliament that gives the laws and that decides about taxes mainly, but a monarch still being the head of government who leads the ministers, again, somewhat like in England. But it seems that at least in his latest, in his most mature thinking, Kant did prefer the thought of at least eventually abolishing the monarchy altogether and having the people self-govern like they tried in France during Kant's last years. Finally, I think the main thing that we can learn from Kant's theory of the Republic and his philosophy of state right here is to not simply, as unfortunately and dangerously is often done nowadays, to not simply say, oh, there's democracy and there's dictatorship, and since we have a democracy and therefore not a dictatorship, all is good and well, and maybe others need to get on our level, they should get rid of their dictatorships, get a liberal democracy like we have, but that's it. Rather, what we can understand from Kant is that, sure, there might have been progress. Our states might be more just and might be somewhat more republican than they were in his time. I mean, going back to the three principles, we can maybe say that the second principle, the equal dependence on the law, that is pretty much done, that we have achieved. But the first principle, the freedom, so only having rational laws that we could have given ourselves, and the third principle, the true fraternal unity, having laws that don't represent just particular interests, but the whole, we might be closer to that than in Kant's time, but we are still far away from truly achieving the ideal republic and a truly just and rational state here. So we should not rest. We should not just think what we have is the best there is and there's no room for improvement, but rather we should keep working on that and fighting for a more republican, a more just, a more rational state. And also what we can learn from Kant is that not everything depends on the system, on who is the ruler. Is there one ruler or are the people the ruler? Nowadays, we focus way too much on saying if only the system is democratic, then all is well. No, from Kant, we can learn that what matters even more, what truly matters, and for which the system is ultimately just a means to an end. We can ask which system serves best as a means, but we should not forget the actual purpose. What truly matters is not just by whom or according to what specific system the state is run, but how it is run. And here, what matters is not just who is the sovereign, but what is his posture. In other words, how aufklärt is he? Which, since we do live in democracies in modern Western countries, that can only mean that the people as such, because it's not just up to one single monarch, the people as such more than ever need to clear themselves off. Now, with that, I'm done describing what the Republic is to Kant, what distinguishes the Republic from despotism. But of course, we are now left with the question, well, what happens if we don't have a republic? And I just said that maybe we might be closer to it than in Kant's days, but we don't have a fully ideal republic. So the question is, how do we get from A to B? How to turn a despotic state into a less despotic, into a more republican state? To which, of course, there are two possible answers: reform or revolution. And this is precisely what I want to discuss in my two next upcoming lectures. Kant, of course, prefers the course of reform and says that for this, mostly what is needed is the freedom to think and to speak your thoughts freely. But he also, of course, had to say a lot about revolutions and, of course, also about the French Revolution happening in his own time. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Leo Allmann, Cenk-Kubilay Altu, Thomas Deuringer, Gernot Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Ökobong, Alexander Reuter, Liserinner, Spendierhosenträger, Ronsul, as well as to all others who support me and my aufkläring cause.